Number 3. Hours of Fallout mysteries to help you sleep easily. There's something about the wasteland at night. When the radiation-scorched sun drops below the horizon and the sky goes that deep, bruised purple it always seems to settle into, the silence that follows is heavier than anything you'd find in the real world. It presses down like a weight you didn't notice accumulating until you stopped moving, the kind of quiet where you become aware of your own breathing, of the small sounds your body makes just by existing. And in that stillness, the mysteries get louder. The questions that 6 games across nearly 30 years never quite answered. The lore buried so deep in terminal entries and holotapes and crumbling personal notes tucked behind filing cabinets in rooms that weren't worth looting, that most players walked right past without knowing anything was there at all. That's what this is. An invitation to stop moving for a while. To settle in, let your shoulders drop, let your jaw unclench, and spend a few hours drifting through everything Fallout left deliberately unanswered. We're going to move through these mysteries slowly, the way you'd move through a ruin you've been exploring for hours already. Carefully, methodically, paying attention to details other people skipped because they were in too much of a hurry to reach the next waypoint. There is no rush here. The wasteland keeps its own schedule, and tonight, that schedule has nothing on it. Some of these mysteries have partial answers that took years of community effort to uncover. Some of them have answers that contradict each other depending on which version of the story you decide to trust, and both versions are supported by evidence, and the game doesn't adjudicate between them. Some of them have no answers at all, and may never have answers, because the people who could have provided them are either fictional or have been gone from the relevant creative process for a very long time. Every one of them is worth sitting with, because the Fallout universe is one of those rare constructed worlds where the unanswered questions tell you as much about the setting as the answered ones do. Sometimes more. The wasteland keeps its secrets close, but tonight we're going to coax them out into the open one at a time, slowly, without hurrying. Settle in. Let's begin. Number. Part 1. Who really ended the world? The Mystery of the Great War. October 23rd. 2077. At 9:13 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time, something happened. Something so catastrophic, so total, so completely and permanently irreversible that it ended civilization on Earth in the span of roughly 2 hours. Bombs fell on cities that had taken centuries to build. Landscapes were reshaped. The sky went dark with debris in the heat of 1,000 simultaneous detonations. And 200 years later, in the world the Fallout franchise asks you to inhabit and explore, the survivors are still living among the consequences, still sleeping in the shadow of that morning, still finding new ways to organize themselves around the ruins of what used to be, without ever quite settling the question of how those ruins came to exist. The question at the absolute center of Fallout's mythology, the one that every game gestures toward and circles around without ever fully committing to a definitive answer, is deceptively simple when you first encounter it. Who fired first? It sounds like it should have an obvious answer. The situation leading up to the Great War in Fallout's alternate history timeline is not subtle or ambiguous in its broad strokes. 2 superpowers, the United States and China, had been locked in a grinding, exhausting, increasingly desperate conflict over dwindling global oil reserves for decades. The Resource Wars, which Fallout's internal timeline dates from roughly 2052, had consumed enormous quantities of money, military capacity, and political will on both sides without producing a resolution. The Sino-American War specifically had dragged on for years, consuming Alaska in a brutal military campaign. China invaded in 2066, seizing the oil pipeline infrastructure there as a direct play for resources. The United States spent years and enormous national treasure pushing them back, eventually reclaiming Anchorage by 2077 with the help of powered armor infantry and a sustained campaign that the game's Operation Anchorage downloadable content lets you relive in virtual reality. By late 2077, American forces had pushed the counterattack so far into the Chinese mainland that Chinese supply lines there were beginning to collapse completely. Both nations were exhausted. Both nations were paranoid. Both nations were sitting on enormous nuclear arsenals and the ideological conviction that the other side represented an existential threat that could not be permitted to win. The powder keg had been visible for a decade. So visible, in fact, that millions of ordinary American citizens had already spent significant money securing spots in one of Vault-Tec's underground shelters, driven by a combination of genuine fear and the company's extraordinarily effective marketing campaign. The billboards were everywhere. The advertisements were cheerful and persuasive and full of bright colors and the specific kind of optimism that only works when the alternative is too dark to look at directly. And then, on one October morning, the missiles flew. What the games categorically refuse to tell you, clearly and with finality, is who gave the order that sent them. The original Fallout Bible, a collection of lore documents compiled in the early years of the franchise by the original development team, is refreshingly honest about this gap. It states, in direct terms, that who struck first is unknown, and that it is not even clear whether the initial volley came from China or from the United States. That ambiguity was not an oversight in the world building. It was a deliberate creative choice, embedded in the fiction from the very beginning, maintained across every subsequent entry. The people who built Fallout's world wanted that answer to stay just out of reach, because a world without a clear first villain is more genuinely unsettling than one where blame can be assigned and filed away. When everyone is potentially at fault, the catastrophe feels more like a warning and less like a story, and Fallout has always wanted to feel like a warning. But over the decades, evidence accumulated in the games anyway, and players built theories from that evidence with remarkable dedication and care. The most intuitive reading of what the games actually show you points toward China as the party that launched first, or at minimum that launched something significant before America's retaliatory strike. In Fallout 4, scattered among the terminal entries and government documents that litter the capital wasteland, there are records from a DEFCON alert system dated to October 23, 2077. The language in those records traces a chain of military alerts suggesting that American detection systems registered incoming signatures consistent with a Chinese attack before the order for a retaliatory strike was issued from the American side. The sequencing in those documents, while not unambiguous, strongly implies that something arrived from the Chinese direction before something left from the American one. The Operation Anchorage downloadable content for Fallout 3 puts players inside a virtual reality simulation of the U.S. military's successful campaign to push Chinese forces out of Alaska, and the scale of that conflict makes it easy to understand how close to the edge both nations were operating by the war's final months. American forces had pushed the counterattack so far into Chinese territory by late 2077 that Chinese supply chains were crumbling. A Chinese government staring down the barrel of complete military defeat on the Alaskan front while simultaneously watching American forces advance into the mainland from another direction might reasonably conclude that conventional, military resistance had become futile. A desperate government with nuclear weapons, nothing left to lose in the conventional military sense, and the ideological conviction that surrender was unacceptable, is one of history's most reliable formulas for nuclear catastrophe. Then there is Captain Zhao, and he complicates everything in the most quietly devastating way the franchise has ever managed. In Fallout 4, the sole survivor finds him aboard the Yangtze, a Chinese nuclear submarine that has been sitting in the irradiated waters off the coast of Boston for over 200 years. He is a ghoul now, transformed by 2 centuries of submarine confinement and radiation exposure, kept alive far past any natural human lifespan by the same forces that haunt every irradiated corner of the post-war world. During the Great War, he launched all but one of his warheads at American cities along the East Coast. Boston was among the targets. The damage the Yangtze's missiles caused to the city is part of the landscape the sole survivor navigates throughout the game. When you talk to him about what he did and why, something quietly remarkable happens. He is not certain that China struck first. He received a launch order. He followed it because he was a naval officer on a submarine, and that was what his chain of command required of him. He fired his missiles in what he understood to be a retaliatory action, but he was not there when the original decision was made. He was not in the room where the first strike order was given, if there was a first strike order, if the situation was even that clean and deliberate. He was a soldier on a vessel following instructions that reached him through a communication chain he could not fully trace. The doubt in his voice, after 2 centuries of living in the dark water with what he did, is not performed. It is genuine and worn and old. He doesn't know. After 200 years, he still doesn't know if what he participated in was retaliation or initiation. That detail is not incidental to what the game is doing. It is the franchise carefully reminding you that the people who carry out catastrophes are often the last to have access to the complete picture of what they are participating in, and that guilt at that scale is almost impossible to assign cleanly because the information was never cleanly distributed to begin with. Tim Kaine, one of the co-creators of the original Fallout game, addressed the question of who fired first in a 2023 interview with a journalist and lore analyst named TK's Mantis. Kaine's answer was offered with the appropriate humility of someone who had been away from the franchise's active creative direction for years, but it was substantive and specific. In his personal understanding of the story he helped create, China fired first. The motivation, in his reading, was the United States' secret bioweapons research, specifically the development of the compound that would become known as the forced evolutionary virus. China had reportedly demanded that the Americans cease this research, which violated international agreements on biological weapons. The Americans had publicly agreed and then quietly moved the research to a different facility rather than ending it. When China discovered the deception, that betrayal was, in Kaine's reading, what pushed their leadership past the threshold into a decision from which there was no return. This interpretation is fascinating for the deeper pattern it suggests. It makes the FEV, the biological agent that goes on to create supermutants and reshape the wasteland's ecology and drive the plots of multiple games, into not just a weapon that shaped the post-war world, but one of the potential causes of the war itself. The experiment that produced so much suffering downstream would have been present at the very source of the catastrophe, cause and consequence woven together in a single scientific project. Kaine was careful to qualify his answer. This was his personal reading, offered years after his departure from Interplay. It had never been written into the games as canonical fact. Other creators might have had other understandings. The ambiguity was intentional and, he believed, worth maintaining. And then the Amazon Prime Video Fallout television series arrived and changed the conversation entirely. The show, confirmed as fully canonical to the game franchise by Todd Howard in his capacity as executive producer, offered a completely different answer to the question of who fired first. One that, when you sit with it and trace its implications forward through everything the games have established, makes a horrible and very specific kind of sense. It was not China. It was not the United States government in any conventional understanding of that institution. It was not a military commander making a desperate calculation at the end of a losing war. According to the show's presentation of events, the first nuclear weapons were launched at Vault-Tec's effective instigation. The show reveals this through a series of pre-war scenes experienced through the perspective of Cooper Howard, who becomes the ghoul that players of the games would recognize as a familiar figure in the wasteland. Before the bombs fell, Vault-Tec had assembled the leadership of America's most powerful corporations for a secret planning meeting. The subject of that meeting was not survival from nuclear war. The subject was what came after nuclear war, and specifically who would be positioned to control it. Vault-Tec had built its entire business model around nuclear war as a premise. The vaults existed because someone at the company had looked at the trajectory of geopolitical events and concluded that the bombs were coming and that the infrastructure of survival was a viable commercial product. They had sold this publicly as civic responsibility. Privately, the product only had value if the catastrophe actually occurred. The show suggests that somewhere in the planning process, the calculation shifted from preparing for a war to ensuring one happened. By cultivating relationships with the right people, by feeding information into systems already prone to paranoia, by ensuring the conditions under which a first strike became not just possible but seemingly rational to the people making the decision, Vault-Tec may have engineered the event that justified its own existence. The company that sold survival from the apocalypse was, in this reading, the company that arranged for the apocalypse to arrive. This is simultaneously the most satisfying and the most troubling version of the answer. Satisfying because it gives the franchise's corporate villainy a coherence and a historical scope that elevates it beyond simple greed or opportunism into something genuinely systemic. Troubling because it means the apocalypse was not a tragedy in the sense of something that no one could have prevented. It was a business decision. Someone or a group of someone sitting in a boardroom with significant resources and a clear profit motive looked at the future of civilization and calculated that there was more value in ending the world deliberately and controlling what grew in its place than in allowing it to continue on its own unpredictable course. The implications of this, traced forward through everything else the franchise has established, are staggering in their scope. If Vault-Tec arranged the Great War, then the vaults, which were always sinister experiments beneath their friendly exterior, become something even darker than social laboratories. They become the contingency plan for a disaster that the people who built them caused. Every family that walked into a vault and sealed the door behind them, trusting the brand, trusting the advertisements, trusting the company that had told them it was protecting them. He was walking into a facility that had been built to profit from a catastrophe its builders had engineered. Every terrible experiment that played out in the sealed dark over 200 years of post-war vault life was the downstream consequence of a choice made in a well-lit conference room by people who believed they understood the future. The mystery of who started the Great War does not resolve into a single clean answer, even after everything the show adds to the picture. It layers. China's military desperation was real, but it may have been cultivated. America's paranoia was real, but it may have been deliberately inflamed. Vault-Tec's role, to the extent the show confirms it, may itself have been directed by the shadowy Enclave organization that we will discuss extensively later in this script. Every answer leads to another question that goes further back, to a darker room, to a smaller group of people making decisions that affected everyone else, and the chain keeps extending backward until it disappears into the pre-war world's shadow government infrastructure, where nothing was ever fully documented, and nothing was ever meant to be. What is certain is this. By 9:14 on October 23, 2077, the missiles were already in the air. By 11 in the morning, it was effectively over. The sky above every major American city turned to fire. The Yangtze's warheads fell on Boston. Millions of people who had trusted Vault-Tec, who had paid for a spot in one of the facilities, who had walked underground through heavy steel doors and believed, genuinely believed, that the doors were protecting them rather than trapping them inside an experiment, found out over the following years and decades exactly what kind of safety they had purchased. The mystery of who started the Great War is, at its deepest level, a mystery about accountability. About what happens when power concentrates so completely in the hands of so few people that the rest of the world becomes a variable in someone else's calculation. About how civilizational catastrophe becomes not just possible, but likely when the systems designed to prevent it have been quietly captured by the people with the most to gain from its occurrence. The game never gives you a single clean answer, because the real world never does either, and the franchise has always known that. The most honest thing Fallout ever says about the Great War is that whoever started it, and whatever the specific sequence of events was that produced those first missiles, the world that existed before it was already the kind of world that could produce exactly this outcome. The conditions were built into the structure long before October 23, 2077 arrived. The wasteland is what's left, and the silence over it, 2 centuries later, is the silence of a question that nobody survived to answer cleanly. Before we go further into the wasteland, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't subscribed yet, there's a button right there. We have a long night of stories ahead, and the wasteland rewards patience. Number. Part 2. Vault-Tec and the Architecture of Cruelty. The vaults were never meant to save everyone. Sit with that sentence for a moment. Not in the cynical way. Not in the way that says, of course, a corporation had ulterior motives. Corporations always have ulterior motives. Sit with it in the specific way the Fallout universe means it. The vaults were not a good-faith shelter system that happened to also contain experiments. The experiments were the point. The shelter was the delivery mechanism for getting people inside. The whole thing, from the Vault-Tec logo to the cheerful advertisements to the carefully calibrated pricing that made spots feel exclusive and therefore desirable, was constructed to produce a specific outcome. Sealed, controlled, monitored human populations that could be used to generate data for purposes their inhabitants would never be informed of. Project Safehouse. That was the official name. The pitch, presented to the public and to the US government that partially funded and sanctioned it, was straightforward. America was in an existential conflict with China. The threat of nuclear exchange was real and worsening. For those with the resources to secure a spot, Vault-Tec had built a network of underground facilities designed to shelter the American population from nuclear catastrophe and allow for civilizational continuity in whatever world survived. The facilities were real. The engineering was genuine. The air filtration systems worked. The food production systems worked. The walls were thick, and the doors were heavy, and people who went inside would, in a structural sense, be protected from the bombs. The thing they would not be protected from was what happened inside once the doors closed. The actual purpose of the vault system, reconstructed across 6 games from terminal entries and government documents, and Vault Tech internal communications, and the testimony of survivors who found pieces of the picture and spent years fitting them together, was to run a comprehensive network of human behavioral experiments. The data from those experiments, systematically collected and analyzed, would be used by the Enclave, the shadow organization that considered itself the legitimate continuation of the American government after the Great War, to understand how post-nuclear human populations behaved under conditions of extreme control, stress, deprivation, and social engineering. If the Enclave was going to govern whatever world came after the bombs, it needed to understand how people in that world could be managed. The vaults were the research program, the residents were the subjects. 122 facilities were eventually constructed. Project Safe House broke ground in 2054 with a proof-of-concept facility beneath Los Angeles, and by 2063, the network was essentially complete. Each vault was assigned an overseer, a specially trained administrator whose briefing included, among the operational parameters, the specifics of the experiment their facility was designed to run. Most overseers understood what they were being asked to do. Most did it anyway. A few had crises of conscience that the surviving records document with considerable detail, sometimes movingly, because even among the people running the experiments there were individuals who understood that what they were doing was wrong and found themselves unable to stop it. The vault population was carefully selected. Space in a typical facility was capped at roughly 1,000 residents. Vault-Tech's admission process was expensive and exclusive, which meant the population of most facilities skewed toward the educated, the professional, the economically comfortable. These were not random cross-sections of the American population. They were people who had the resources to secure a spot, who had the cultural capital to trust the company's promise, who represented, in Vault-Tech's internal assessments, the most productive and resilient segments of the civilian population, the best specimens for whatever was going to be run on them. Selected, in a real sense, to be spent. The experiments themselves were designed with considerable methodological sophistication. They were not random cruelties inflicted for their own sake, though many of them produced suffering that was indistinguishable from deliberate torture in its effects. They were structured research protocols attempting to generate specific data about human behavior under specific conditions. Together they form a portrait of a research program systematically mapping the limits of human community, specifically the conditions under which cooperation breaks down, authority collapses, and communities tear themselves apart. The knowledge of where those limits were, and what crossed them, was precisely what a governing body would need if its primary interest was not the welfare of a population, but its management. Vault 11 in New Vegas is built around a mechanism so elegant in its cruelty that it almost reads as philosophical. The vault's residents were informed upon arrival that one member of their community must be sacrificed each year. If they refused, the entire population would be executed. The designers wanted to observe how a community responded to institutionalized murder committed in service of collective survival. Whether the social pressure toward group continuity would consistently override individual moral objection to selecting and killing another person. The answer the experiment produced was yes, for a long time, and then far more than yes, and then something much worse than the experiment had anticipated. The inhabitants built a political system around the sacrifice. Factions formed, organized not around ideology in any traditional sense, but around the annual question of who would be selected. The vote became the vault's primary political event, a proxy war between competing groups that could ensure their own members' safety by accumulating enough political capital to direct the selection elsewhere. Over decades, the political machinery around the sacrifice became more elaborate, more entrenched, more consuming of the community's energy and attention, and then it became a civil war. The conflict that had been structured around determining who died each year escalated into a direct military conflict that left the vast majority of the vault's population dead. 5 survivors eventually reached the vault's control room and met the administrative computer that had been monitoring the experiment. They expected a reward, or at least acknowledgement, for having survived and for having, in the final moments, refused the last sacrifice. The computer told them they were being commended for demonstrating the courage to break the cycle, and then it informed them that as punishment for all the missed sacrifices during the years of civil war, the remaining population would now be executed. 4 of the 5 survivors chose to return to the vault and die with their community rather than walk away from it. One person walked out alone. The recording of those voices, preserved in the vault's terminal system for any player willing to explore carefully enough, is one of the quietest tragedies the games produce. The experiment got exactly the data it was designed to collect, and the cost was almost everyone. Vault 87 in the Capital Wasteland was where the Enclave's biological weapons research met the vault population in the most direct possible way. The evolutionary experimentation program began there in 2078, just 1 year after the Great War, using the vault's residents as test subjects for FEV strains delivered through the air and water systems they depended on for survival. By 2079, the mutations had progressed far enough that the converted residents broke free of containment and began capturing and converting anyone they could reach on the surface above. The super mutants that make the Capital Wasteland so persistently dangerous in Fallout 3 all trace their origin to one vault, one experiment, and 1 year of uncontrolled biological research conducted on people who had no idea what was in the water they were drinking. Vault 112 in Virginia ran perhaps the most philosophically troubling experiment of any in the franchise, not because of its violence but because of its duration and the nature of what it did to the person running it. The vault's residents were placed in simulation pods, connected to a virtual reality environment called Tranquility Lane. In the simulation, they lived in a pristine, pre-war American suburb. They did not know they were in a simulation. They had no memory of being placed in the pods. For them, the bombs had not fallen, the vault did not exist, and life continued in a comfortable and thoroughly artificial version of normal. Dr. Stanislaus Braun, the vault's administrator, had arranged for his consciousness to be preserved in a brain-in-a-jar housing unit, specifically so he could monitor and manage the experiment across whatever duration was required. He had, in other words, planned on spending decades or centuries watching over people who didn't know they were being watched. What the experiment documented was what happened to the watcher, not just the watched, when that arrangement was sustained for 200 years with no accountability and no external check on behavior. When the lone wanderer finds Vault 112, Braun has been running nightmare scenarios for the pod occupants for over 2 centuries. He has killed them and reset them, and made them watch each other die, and killed them again. He treats the simulation's inhabitants as entertainment that has grown stale and must constantly be refreshed, with new suffering to remain interesting. What Braun became in that sealed vault, alone with his absolute authority over people who could not resist him, is what the Overseer system risked producing everywhere it operated. A person who began with a legitimate purpose and eventually had no purpose but the exercise of control, because control had been the only thing available to him for so long that it had become the only thing he understood as meaningful. Vault 21 in Las Vegas organized all disputes through gambling, which turned out to produce a relatively stable community for a surprisingly long time, because fair procedures generate social acceptance in ways that outcomes alone never can. People can live with losing a fair game in ways they cannot live with arbitrary decisions. The vault operated until Mr. House won it in a card game and stripped it for useful technology, terminating the experiment by external intervention from someone who was simply better at the vault's own organizing mechanism than the experiment had anticipated. Vault 92 exposed its residents, all musicians, to subliminal aggression conditioning through the speaker systems they assumed were simply playing ambient audio. The progressive escalation of aggression among the population was documented in detail in terminal entries that any player who explores the location carefully can read, watching the community deteriorate week by week until the final massacre. Vault 95 placed recovering addicts in a controlled environment and then reintroduced chems through operatives embedded in the population, studying relapse under controlled conditions. The relapse was total, and the community was destroyed. The pattern across all of these experiments is not random cruelty. It is systematic data collection in service of a specific research agenda. Vault-Tech's designers were building a comprehensive map of human community failure, where cooperation breaks down. What conditions produce violence? What mechanisms of authority maintain compliance? And what mechanisms produce resistance? The knowledge of those thresholds, applied by a governing body to a post-nuclear population that had no historical precedent for its situation, was power of a kind that no ordinary political instrument could provide. The cruelest part might be the advertising. The cheerful Vault Boy, the upbeat radio spots, the partnerships with Nuka-Cola and other trusted brands, the whole cultural infrastructure of safety and hope that Vault-Tec constructed around its product. People bought spots in the vaults because they trusted the image, because a smiling cartoon character in a blue jumpsuit felt like a promise that someone had thought this through, that someone had a plan, that someone was genuinely trying to protect them. The gap between that image and what was actually being planned in Vault-Tec's boardrooms is wide enough to fall into and never reach the bottom of. 200 years later, the descendants of those vault residents are still paying the price. The super mutants spreading across every wasteland. The psychological damage documented in every settlement that includes former vault dwellers. The lingering effects of every experiment that ran its course. All of it traces back to people who trusted a company that was never planning to do what they trusted it to do. Number, Part 3. The Courier's Ghost Who is Courier 6. The Courier starts the game face down in a shallow grave in the Goodspring Cemetery, with 2 bullets in their skull and no memory of being shot. That is an unusual opening for a role-playing game protagonist. Most games of this type give you a face, a family, a past, a reason to be where you are. Fallout New Vegas gives you a body in the dirt, a gunshot wound to the back of the head, and the strong suggestion that everything you need to know about who you were before this moment, you are going to have to reconstruct on the way. Courier 6 is, by deliberate design, the most thoroughly mysterious protagonist the franchise has built. And the more carefully you follow the threads of that mystery through the game's main story and its 4 downloadable content expansions, the more deeply unsettling the picture underneath becomes. The available surface facts are intentionally spare. The Courier works for Mojave Express, a courier service operating out of Prim. They were the 6th courier hired to make a specific delivery, carrying a platinum chip from the Mojave Express office to the New Vegas Strip. They stepped in when the courier originally assigned to the job declined at the last minute. The nature of that declination, and the reason for it, is the key that unlocks the most significant mystery in the game's story. The courier who turned down the job was a man named Ulysses. He was a regular and reliable employee of Mojave Express, experienced across long routes through dangerous territory. When the platinum chip delivery came in, Ulysses looked at the manifest. He read something there, either a name or a routing detail or a marking, that he recognized. And he walked away from the job without explanation, leaving the company to scramble for a replacement. The courier was that replacement. They picked up the chip, set out for New Vegas, and were ambushed near a location called Gene Skydiving by a group of great cons, led by a man in a checkered suit named Benny. Benny shot the courier twice in the back of the head and had them buried. Victor, a Securitron operating under the quiet direction of Robert House, dug them out. Doc Mitchell performed surgery that by any reasonable standard should have been impossible and put the courier back together. And then, with 2 healing bullet holes in their skull, the courier woke up and the story began. What unfolds across the game and its expansions is the gradual reconstruction of a past that the wounds made inaccessible. Not completely inaccessible. Fragments remain. Dialogue options throughout the main game hint at skills and languages and knowledge that the courier possesses without being able to fully account for. They speak some Spanish, they know a few words of Latin. Their combat capability and wilderness survival instincts suggest years of experience in the wasteland rather than any sheltered upbringing. The profile that emerges from these scattered details is of someone who has been living and working in the Mojave region for years before the game begins. Someone with experience, connections, and a reputation substantial enough that Ulysses recognized their name on a delivery manifest and decided he could not take the job. The largest piece of the courier's hidden history is the Divide, and it sits at the center of the Lonesome Road downloadable content, like a wound the game has been building towards since the opening credits. The Divide was a region of canyon country and ruined highway in the territory between California and Nevada. After the Great War, it was desolate in the standard wasteland way, but it had something unusual: functional military infrastructure buried in the geology beneath it. Old ICBM silos, still powered by automated systems, still connected to launch mechanisms that pre-war engineers had maintained against the possibility of eventual use. People, discovering this slowly over years of exploration, began gathering in the canyons. They built structures. They shared resources. They began the tentative, fragile process of turning proximity into community. The divide wasn't a city. It wasn't even a significant settlement by the standards of the Mojave's more established locations. But it was becoming something. The courier had been through the divide many times. Courier work took them through a lot of territory, and the divide's geography made it a natural route. The people there knew the courier's face and functioned the way small communities know reliable service workers: present, recognizable, trusted in a specific and limited way. On one particular trip, the courier was carrying a package. It came from a former enclave facility called Navarro. The package was sealed. Opening sealed packages is not what couriers do. The courier carried it through the divide as part of a routine working day. What was inside the package was a device that, once it reached the divide, activated the dormant launch systems buried in the silos beneath the canyon. The missiles fired. Several of them. Not all, but enough. The explosions tore the landscape apart. The settlement was destroyed. The people who had been building there, cautiously and slowly and against significant odds, were killed. The canyons were reshaped by the blasts into the fractured, wind-scoured, permanently irradiated landscape that the Lonesome Road DLC takes place in. The courier was gone before any of this happened. They had delivered the package and left, as couriers do. Ulysses was in the divide when the missiles fired. He survived because he had departed before the courier arrived, but he came back afterward and found what remained. He understood, eventually, what had caused the destruction. He spent years tracking the person responsible for it, not because he wanted revenge in any simple sense, but because he needed something more complicated. He needed the courier to understand what they had done. He had built a philosophy around this need, a framework about weight and accountability, and what it means to carry things through the world without knowing what they contain, and he had nowhere to direct it except at the person whose hand had held the package. When the courier finally meets Ulysses in the Lonesome Road, he has loaded the divide's remaining missiles and plans to launch them at both the NCR and Caesar's Legion. His stated rationale is that he wants to demonstrate the principle. To make the courier watch something be erased the way the divide was erased. To transmit, through experience rather than argument, the specific quality of loss that results from something being made to not exist by a force it didn't see coming. The game's writing in this DLC is remarkable precisely because Ulysses is not simply wrong. The courier did destroy the divide. The ignorance in which they did it is a documented fact, but it does not undo the outcome. The people are still dead. The settlement is still gone. Whatever the community might eventually have become is permanently foreclosed. The weight of that is real, and Ulysses' grief is proportional to it. But the DLC also asks whether grief carried alone for years, processed in the ruins of the thing it mourns, without correction or conversation or any external perspective, remains grief in the form that entitles its bearer to the moral authority Ulysses claims. Whether it has become something that looks like justice from the inside but functions, from any external vantage point, as the displacement of an unbearable personal loss onto a set of actions that will produce more loss, the courier can argue this. They can persuade Ulysses that whatever the weight of the divide requires, adding to it is not the measurement. That destruction in response to destruction is not accounting. It is just more destruction. In Old World Blues, the Big MT's scientists remove the courier's brain, spine, and heart for experimentation, replacing them with technological substitutes. When the courier eventually finds their extracted brain and speaks to it, the brain has memories and opinions that the primary consciousness can no longer fully access. The conversation between a person and their own separated gray matter, conducted across a laboratory table in the most surreal of the game's DLC settings, is funny in the way Old World Blues handles everything, but underneath the comedy is a genuinely disorienting question about what identity is when the physical substrate of memory has been separated from the body that claimed to be the person those memories belong to. The mystery of who the courier was before Benny's ambush may be permanently unanswerable within the fiction. The game declines to answer it. What it does instead is give you the outline. Someone experienced, someone multilingual, someone with a past in the divide that they cannot fully access, someone whose name meant enough to Ulysses that he walked away from a lucrative job rather than encounter it again. The shape of that person is visible in the negative space. The details are not. Whatever was written on that delivery manifest, whatever name was attached to Courier 6, the Wasteland is still feeling the consequences of what they did with a sealed package on an ordinary working day. and the person who carried it will never fully know what they were carrying. Number. Part 4. The Mysterious Stranger, a shadow that never explains itself. He has appeared in every single Fallout game. Let that sit for a moment before we continue. Not a recurring faction with new representatives in each entry. Not a recurring location that players return to across different timelines. A specific individual person, identifiable across decades of franchise history by his long dark coat, his wide-brimmed hat, and the revolver he carries, who has been reported in combat situations across the continental United States for a period spanning at minimum 120 years of documented post-war history, and almost certainly longer. He appears without warning. He fires his weapon. He leaves before anyone can address him. He has done this in the Capital Wasteland, in the Mojave, in the Commonwealth, in Appalachia. He does not explain himself. He never has. The Mysterious Stranger is the longest-running mystery the franchise has maintained. And the longer it runs, the more deliberate his continued inexplicability seems. In the original 1997 Fallout, he appears with the Mysterious Stranger perk as a random combat ally who materializes, fires, and vanishes. The game presents this as a perk mechanic, a system reward that occasionally summons assistance, a framing clearly designed to waive the question of what he actually is within the fiction by treating him as a game convention rather than a narrative element. A wink at the player. Don't look too hard at this one. But then the games kept coming, and with each appearance, the stranger accumulated slightly more detail, slightly more texture, in ways that suggested someone was thinking carefully about him without being willing to resolve the thinking into an explanation. In Fallout 3, companions register surprise or unease when the stranger materializes during combat. Their reactions suggest recognition without being able to account for it. A minor NPC in a context most players never encounter seems to have some relationship to the figure that neither character can articulate. The moment passes and the game moves on, having added weight to the mystery without explaining it. In Fallout New Vegas, the most significant canonical evidence about the stranger's identity arrives in the least expected location. The Lonesome Drifter is a character the player finds camped in the desert north of the El Dorado gas and service station, sitting alone with a guitar, working through a song. He is a wanderer with no settled home and no faction, moving through the Mojave by a logic that seems personal rather than practical. When you talk to him, he mentions his father. He says his father was a mysterious man, a stranger to his own family. He was never around. He traveled to places he couldn't describe and came back from them without explanations. The Lonesome Drifter carries a weapon called the Mysterious Magnum. When drawn, it plays the same guitar riff that accompanies every appearance of the Mysterious Stranger. When holstered, a different note completes the musical phrase. The inference is clear and clearly deliberate. The Lonesome Drifter is the Mysterious Stranger's son, a man who grew up without a father because his father was perpetually elsewhere, appearing in strangers' lives at moments of crisis and then vanishing before anyone could ask him to stay. In Fallout 4, Nick Valentine has an open case file on the Mysterious Stranger sitting among the active cases in his detective office. Nick is a synth built to be the most analytically capable investigator the Commonwealth can produce. A person who has spent decades studying human behavior and reconstructing histories from fragments. His notes on the stranger describe a figure matching the known description, appearing in conflict situations dating back decades before Fallout 4's events, with no consistent location, no apparent organizational affiliation, no explanation for a lifespan that has long since exceeded anything biology could account for. Nick has been pursuing this case for years. His notes conclude, in essence, that he cannot solve it. The evidence does not point to any conclusion he can defend. The Mysterious Stranger is the one problem that Nick Valentine, the franchise's most dedicated investigator, has quietly accepted he cannot solve. The literary lineage of the character traces to multiple sources, most specifically to H.P. Lovecraft's structural approach to inexplicability and to Mark Twain's unfinished manuscript titled The Mysterious Stranger. Twain's story features a supernatural figure who appears in a small town and operates according to rules that the human characters around him cannot access, performs impossible feats, manipulates events with a kind of detached playfulness, and exists entirely outside the moral framework that governs everyone else in the story. The manuscript was never completed. Twain worked on it across the last 20 years of his life without being able to bring it to an ending. There are multiple published versions representing different stages of a text he never stopped revising. The story has no resolution because Twain could never decide what the resolution should be. The parallel to the Fallout Stranger is not accidental. A figure who operates by rules nobody else can access, who has been active for longer than any ordinary human life permits, who has no apparent stake in the outcomes he influences beyond the immediate act of appearing and helping and leaving, occupies the same conceptual space as Twain's supernatural visitor. The franchise appears to have looked at that tradition and decided that the most interesting version of the archetype was the one that left the question of what he was permanently and deliberately open. Because some mysteries, when explained, stop being mysteries and start being plot points. And the mysterious stranger works because he is still genuinely strange, still genuinely outside the frameworks the world provides for understanding things like him. He had a son. His son wanders the desert with his father's gun and his father's musical theme, making music alone in the wasteland, not quite understanding why the wandering feels necessary or what the melody on the gun is supposed to mean. The son is the only evidence that the stranger was ever a person with human attachments, with a family, with a life that included someone who needed him to stay. What he is now, 2 centuries after the bombs fell, materializing in combat situations across the continent without explanation, is something the franchise has spent 30 years carefully not answering. And at this point, the not answering is itself the most significant creative decision that has ever been made about him. Number Part 5? The Dunwich Horror Fallout's Ancient Darkness. Most of Fallout's threats have explanations that fit within the world's own rules. Raiders operate according to the logic of scarcity and violence. Supermutants are the product of specific documented biological research. Deathclaws were bred as weapons by a pre-war military program and released into the wild when the program ended. The Brotherhood of Steel's territorial behavior flows from an ideology that the game traces carefully back to a specific historical moment. Even the most bizarre elements of the setting, the talking ghouls and the fusion-powered power armor, and the intelligent robots with human personalities, all have underlying explanations that cohere within the game's internal physics. Fallout is, fundamentally, a science fiction universe that respects its own rules. And then there is the Dunwich thing, which does not. In Fallout 3, in the southwestern part of the capital wasteland, near an area the pre-war maps labeled the Dunwich Dump, there is a building. It belongs to a corporation that no longer exists. From the outside, it is unremarkable. A ruined office structure occupied by feral ghouls. The kind of location that experienced players move through efficiently without lingering. Players who slow down in the Dunwich building, who pay careful attention to the atmosphere and the distribution of objects, and the specific quality of the wrongness that accumulates as they descend, find something that the game categorically refuses to explain. At the bottom of the building, below everything, there is a cave. In the cave, there is an altar. On and around the altar, there are skulls arranged with deliberate, practiced intent, not scattered by violence, but placed with care that implies long repetition. At the center of the arrangement, there is an obelisk, carved from stone, with imagery that looks ancient in a way that the surrounding pre-war ruins do not. Not wasteland ancient, which means 2 centuries at most. Old ancient. The kind of old that predates the United States, possibly by a very long time. Something was worshipped here. Something has been worshipped here for far longer than the building above it has existed. And that something has a name. Ugg-Qualtoth. The name itself is the first and clearest signal of where the game's designers went for their source material. HP. Lovecraft's mythology of cosmic horror populated the fictional universe of his stories, with entities whose names followed specific phonetic conventions designed to feel ancient, non-human, and linguistically outside any known tradition. Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, Shub-Niggurath. The convention was constructed to produce the sensation that these names came from a language that predated human language, that they belonged to things older than the words humans use for things. Ugg-Qualtoth fits this pattern with a precision that is clearly deliberate. The designers knew exactly what tradition they were working in and chose it specifically. Lovecraft's Yog-Sothoth, the entity whose name most closely echoes Ugg-Qualtoth's construction, exists outside of time, knows all things across all moments simultaneously, and exists at scales so far beyond human comprehension that the concept of worship, which implies a hierarchical relationship that makes some relational sense between worshipper and worshipped, is almost a category error when applied to the interaction between a human being and something like this. People worship it anyway, because worship is the closest behavioral register the human nervous system can produce in response to something that comprehensively exceeds its capacity for understanding. The obelisk in the Dunwich building connects, through the Point Lookout DLC for Fallout 3, to a family called the Blackhawls, who have been tangled in the Dunwich mythology for generations. Obadiah Blackhall, the last of that line, desperately wants to retrieve a book called the Krivbekni, which the swamp folk of Point Lookout have maintained in a ritual context across 200 years of post-war isolation. He claims that returning it to its proper place of destruction is the only way to sever the connection that the swamp folk's practices maintain with whatever the Krivbekni represents. Cut content from his questline confirms that one of his ancestors was named Richard Dunwich, the founder of the Dunwich Corporation. The Dunwich Corporation built the Dunwich Building. The Dunwich Corporation also built and operated the Dunwich Borers Quarry in Fallout 4's Commonwealth, a marble extraction facility in the northeast of the map that players who explore carefully discover is something considerably more than a marble extraction facility. The Dunwich Borers is where the thread goes from suggestive to genuinely disturbing. The quarry is occupied by raiders, which is unremarkable. What makes it unusual is what the terminal entries scattered through the facility document. Foremen reporting that workers in the deeper sections are behaving erratically, descriptions of sounds coming from below levels that the active excavation has any reason to reach, personnel refusing to continue past certain depths without being able to explain why, only that something about the air down there made continuation feel wrong in ways they couldn't articulate. As the sole survivor descends, the game triggers a series of flashbacks at specific locations. Each one shows the same space in the pre-war period, during the quarry's active operation. Workers in Dunwich Borers uniforms, industrial equipment functioning properly. And in the periphery of each vision, among the mundane images of labor, other things. Gatherings of workers engaged in activities that the dim and fragmented quality of the flashback images prevent from being fully resolved, but that clearly have nothing to do with stone extraction. When each flashback ends and the present reasserts itself, the person who was visible in the vision has become a feral ghoul. Every time, without exception. The connection is never explained. At the absolute bottom of the quarry, submerged in dark water at the end of a descent that has been progressively stripping away the mundane explanations that the upper levels provide, there is a stone altar. It is ancient, pre-war, in a way that implies a very long time before the war. Carved pillars surround it. Symbols cover the surfaces in no language that any scholar in the game's world has been able to identify. Resting on the altar is a knife called Creme vs. Tooth, unique in its construction and clearly ritual rather than practical in its purpose. And beneath the water that surrounds the altar, visible if you look down through the murk with patience, is the faint but unmistakable outline of an enormous stone face, looking upward. From beneath the floor of what the corporate documents described as a marble quarry, the face is massive. The altar sits directly above it. The quarry was built around the altar. Dunwich Borers LLC, a company tracing its origin to Richard Dunwich and connected through his family to everything the Point Lookout DLC documents about the Qualtoth tradition, was excavating in the direction of something that had been there, enormous and positioned as an object of reverence, long before the company broke ground. The excavation was not incidental to the site. The site was the reason for the excavation. This is the thing the Dunwich thread refuses to explain. What Dunwich Borers LLC was actually trying to accomplish. Access to the entity? Extraction of it? Some ritual completion that required the excavation itself? The corporate records that survive don't say, because the corporate records were never written to say. Whatever the people running the company understood about what they were doing, they understood it well enough to know it should not be written down in any document that might be found by someone without the relevant background. The entity that the obelisk honors, that the Krivbekni connects to, that the altar serves, that the enormous carved face in the water beneath the Dunwich Borers represents, was present before the Great War, before the corporation that built above it, before the United States existed as a political entity. It operates on timescales that make the Fallout franchise's 250 years of documented history look like an interruption brief enough to ignore. The bombs didn't disturb it. The 2 centuries of post-war mutation and collapse and reorganization didn't affect it. Whatever it is, it remains. Kremv's tooth rests on its altar in the dark water. The carved face looks upward through the murk. In the swamps of Maryland, people who have forgotten almost everything their ancestors knew maintain the forms of practices whose content they can no longer articulate, because the forms have survived even when the meaning has not. And the question of what Ug Qualtoth actually is remains outside the reach of any explanation the game's universe provides. Number, Part 6. The FEV and the Master's Dream. The forced evolutionary virus begins with ambition and ends with a wasteland full of creatures that are simultaneously the result of a man's vision and the evidence of why that vision was always going to fail. Westtech's NBC division developed the FEV in the pre-war period as a defense research project. The official mandate was the creation of biological agents that could produce super soldiers, humans systematically upgraded beyond the biological baseline. Stronger, more resistant to disease and radiation, with enhanced sensory and physical capability. The theoretical endpoint was a human being whose body had been rewritten by a virus to perform at levels that genetics alone couldn't produce. Fighting capability derived from biology rather than equipment. The virus was designed to inject pre-programmed genetic corrections into host cells, overriding what its designers called recessive flaws and amplifying beneficial traits. The mechanism was elegant by the standards of the era's biotechnology. The results were not what anyone had designed, the elegant mechanism to produce. Full-scale FEV testing on human subjects began at the Mariposa military base in Central California. The base's security personnel were not informed of what the scientists were actually doing. When they found out, they revolted. They killed several researchers, worked to contain the situation, and when the Great War ended any possibility of government intervention from outside, their leader made the decision that would define the next 2 centuries of wasteland history. He gathered the surviving personnel, declared that the abuse of technology and science that had happened at Mariposa was exactly the kind of thing that could not be permitted to continue, and founded an organization dedicated to preventing it. That organization became the Brotherhood of Steel. The Brotherhood's origin, and by extension its centuries of territorial technological hoarding and its complex relationship with scientific research, traces directly to a single bioweapons experiment gone wrong in a California military installation before the bombs fell. The FEV survived the war in the pressurized vats at Mariposa, viable and potent. When a survivor named Richard Gray fell into one of those vats during post-war exploration of the ruins, the next chapter of the story began. Gray's audio diary, recorded in the weeks following his immersion, is one of the most quietly harrowing documents in all of Fallout's written content. He describes the physical experience in detail that the games never visualize, but that the text makes vivid. The pain of initial contact, the sense of his body beginning to change at a cellular level, his skin peeling and rebuilding, awareness expanding into directions he doesn't have language for, the emergence of new physical capabilities, including tendrils he uses to gather sustenance and eventually to absorb the biomass and awareness of other creatures. His intellect, rather than being degraded by exposure as most FEV strains degrade intelligence, was amplified. He became smarter, and then he became something that called itself the Master. The Master's vision was, by his own logic, idealistic. He had concluded that baseline humanity was not viable in the post-war environment. The radiation, the disease, the resource scarcity, the accumulated environmental pressure of nuclear catastrophe, all of it was making unmodified human survival increasingly difficult. His solution was to accelerate the evolutionary transition that the FEV had begun in him, to upgrade humanity to a form better suited to the world that actually existed, rather than the world that used to exist and had been destroyed. He called this project the Unity. He built an army of converted supermutants to accomplish it. By the time the Vault Dweller confronts him in the original Fallout, the Unity is a significant military and ideological force with genuine momentum. The resolution of that confrontation is one of the franchise's most remarkable creative achievements. The player can defeat the Master not through combat but through argument, specifically by presenting him with a fact he has somehow missed or suppressed in his own data. Supermutants are sterile. The FEV conversion process, in every strain and every application, renders the converted subject incapable of reproduction. the unity can grow only by converting existing humans. When no humans remain to convert, the last generation of supermutants will age and die with no successors. The vision of a humanity upgraded for the new world is, in biological fact, a plan for the extinction of humanity. The Master confirms this against his own data. The data was there. He had not examined it carefully because examining it carefully would have destroyed the framework that gave his transformed existence purpose. The FEV had given him intelligence and scope and a mission. Looking at the sterility data with the attention it deserved would have required dismantling the mission. He chose not to look. And when the Vault Dweller forces the look, the ideology collapses, and the Master destroys himself and his operation along with it. The tragedy of the Master is precisely this. He was not stupid. He was extraordinarily intelligent. He had thought carefully about the future. He had planned for variables and contingencies. And he still missed the central flaw in his plan, not because he lacked the capacity to find it, but because he had a reason not to. Intelligence applied in the service of a conclusion already reached is not inquiry. It is advocacy. The most capable thinker in the wasteland was, on the question that mattered most, not thinking at all. He was rationalizing. The FEV continued in different strains and different applications after the Master's death, each iteration producing new problems that its designers had not anticipated, because the gap between what this particular technology was designed to do and what it actually did in contact with living biological systems was never fully bridged by anyone who worked with it. In the capital wasteland, the Enclave developed a strain specifically engineered to kill everyone whose genetics showed radiation-induced mutation, which meant everyone who had survived the war on the surface, an act of genocide framed internally as sanitation. In the Commonwealth, the Institute used FEV-derived research as a foundation for synthetic life, with results that generated their own decades of ethical and practical catastrophe. The FEV is Fallout's most consistent argument against the hubris of biological intervention, not because the technology itself is evil in some mystical sense, but because every person who has worked with it has been trying to solve a real problem with a tool they did not fully understand. The problems were real. The solutions were worse. Number. Part 7. Robert House, the man who bet against the end of the world. Robert Edwin House was orphaned young, watched his half-brother take everything that should have been his, and converted both of those experiences into fuel for a project that lasted the rest of his life. He founded Robco Industries at 22 years old. By the time of the Great War, Robco manufactured the Pip-Boy wrist computers used by every Vault Dweller, the Protectron and Mr. Handy robots that appear in every post-war settlement with enough infrastructure to maintain them, the terminals that stored 2 centuries of personal records and corporate documents, and last messages from people who knew the bombs were minutes away. There is almost nowhere in any Fallout game that does not have a Robco product somewhere in it. House built the nervous system of the pre-war world, and parts of that nervous system are still running 2 centuries after everything else stopped. He predicted the Great War before it happened. Not vaguely. Not in the way that any politically aware person could see the general trajectory of events and conclude that things were heading somewhere bad. House ran quantitative models. He analyzed geopolitical data, military spending trajectories, resource depletion curves, and the historical patterns of great power conflict. He calculated not just that a nuclear exchange was likely, but approximately when it would occur. He was a few days off from the actual date of October 23, 2077, a miscalculation he has described in the game's text as the greatest single failure of his analytical career. His preparation, in the decade before the bombs, was commensurate with his certainty. He developed a missile defense network for Las Vegas, laser turrets, interceptor systems, positioned to shoot down incoming warheads before they could reach the Strip. The system worked imperfectly, because the system was built by humans working against an unprecedented threat with technology that had never been tested at scale. Several warheads reached the Las Vegas area. The Strip sustained damage, but the core buildings survived. The Lucky 38 stood. The lights, eventually, still worked. He also arranged for his own survival by placing his consciousness into a life support and computing system within the Lucky 38, where it could be maintained across whatever duration was required. His biological body deteriorated over 2 centuries of this preservation into something the game describes, when you finally encounter it, as a husk kept technically alive by machines. but the intelligence and the personality and the capacity for strategic planning remained intact and undegraded. When the dust had settled after 200 years, Robert House was still there, still in the Lucky 38, still calculating. By 2281, the year New Vegas takes place, House has transformed the remnants of Las Vegas into a functioning city-state. He recruited, organized, and installed 3 tribal groups on the Strip: the Chairmen at the Tops, the White Glove Society at the Ultra Lux, and the Omertas at Gomorrah. He maintains control over all 3 through economic dependency, carefully managed information environments, and the ever-present background of his Securitron army. He has, by any reasonable measure, succeeded at an extraordinary level. He predicted the apocalypse, survived it on his own terms, and built something functional from the wreckage while everyone else was still figuring out how to eat. His long-term plan, revealed to the courier if they choose to work with him, is the one he has been executing since before the bombs fell. He wants to take humanity to space. He believes, with what appears to be complete sincerity, that a species confined to a single nuclear-scarred planet is a species in the early stages of extinction, and that the entire project of post-war recovery needs to be oriented toward developing the technology to leave Earth rather than simply rebuilding what was lost. He wants to be alive to direct that project. He believes his 2-century perspective on human history uniquely qualifies him to lead it. The problem with House is not that he's wrong about the facts. The NCR does show the institutional decay he describes. The Legion is genuinely unsustainable as he claims. His assessment of independent New Vegas's long-term challenges is more accurate than the idealistic framing of that option suggests. The problem is that being right about the large-scale analytical claims has not given him any insight into what it costs to live under the authority of someone who is certain they are right. After 2 centuries of governing through cameras and robots and carefully managed relationships, his theory of what human beings need is a theory assembled from the outside, accurate in its large patterns, missing something essential in the small ones. The television show's portrayal of pre-war House, played by Justin Theroux, adds the layer that the game could only imply, that even House was surprised by the specific shape the apocalypse took. That someone, in the critical days before October 23rd, was operating at a level of strategic depth he had not accounted for. That the man who predicted the Great War was, in the end, one step behind the people who arranged it. What that means for his certainty about his plans for the post-war world is a question the show raises without answering, and the game's version of House, 2 centuries deeper into his isolated calculation, shows no signs of having resolved it. He presses on. The plan continues. The Lucky 38's cameras watch everything. And somewhere in the arithmetic of Robert House's certainty, the variable he has not adequately weighted is the thing that always undoes people who are certain they understand the future. The thing that does not appear in the models because the models were built by someone who decided what mattered before they started calculating. Number. Part 8. The Children of Adam, does the wasteland have a god? The most radical question the Fallout franchise has ever posed, delivered through a religious faction most players categorize as peripheral and easy to dismiss, is whether the bomb accomplished something genuinely divine. The Children of Adam worship nuclear radiation. Their theology holds that the great deity Adam expresses itself through nuclear fission. When a bomb explodes, it does not destroy but divides, and in dividing creates. Every person who dies in a nuclear blast is not dying but transcending, their constituent particles joining a universal presence the children call the glow. Their God is the process of atomic division itself, and every nuclear detonation is a sacrament. The bomb is the expression of divine will, and being irradiated is being touched by that will. From outside this framework, the children read as a textbook example of trauma mythology. Of course, some people, confronted with a civilization-ending nuclear catastrophe, would build a theology around its instrument. The human need to make meaning from suffering is one of the most reliable features of the species. Converting the source of all suffering into evidence of divine purpose is a more psychologically sophisticated move than it first appears. It transforms victims into witnesses, converts a random catastrophe into a purposeful event, and gives community members a framework for making sense of the radiation-saturated world they inhabit. Except for the radiation resistance, which does not fit the psychological explanation cleanly. Members of the children of Adam who have maintained the faith devotedly for extended periods exhibit elevated radiation resistance by any measurable standard. In Fallout 3, the children who tend the unexploded bomb at the center of Megaton, who anoint themselves regularly with the irradiated water that pools around it, should by the game's own internal logic be showing significantly worse health outcomes than they actually display. In Far Harbor, the children have established their primary sanctuary on the most heavily irradiated section of an island whose radiation levels are genuinely lethal for characters without specialized protection. They live there as their preferred habitat. Material explanations exist and are presented by the games. Adam's glow, a substance that increases radiation resistance. Long-term adaptation through extended low-level exposure. The cognitive effects of the island's fog, which could produce fervor that resembles faith from a certain analytical distance. These explanations are plausible. They account for most of what is observed. Sister Confessor Tectus, the leader of the Far Harbor Children, has a certainty that the material explanations don't fully account for. His conviction does not read as the comfort-seeking of someone who found a framework that helps. It reads as the certainty of someone who has, in some way the game does not specify, received confirmation of what they believe. And the dialogue available to the sole survivor in conversations with him edges toward territory that the game's normal physics of radiation and mutation and pre-war technology does not cleanly cover. The nucleus, the children's Far Harbor sanctuary, sits above a functional nuclear submarine. One narrative path through the DLC involves giving Tectus the launch codes for that submarine's remaining missiles. The combination of sincere theological conviction that nuclear detonation is divine transcendence and physical control over nuclear launch capability is one of the most efficiently concentrated points of danger the franchise has ever assembled. Joshua Graham, the burned man of New Vegas's Honest Hearts expansion, approaches the question of divine presence from a different direction. He was once Caesar's most effective military officer. When he became a liability, Caesar had him wrapped in pitch, set on fire, and thrown into the Grand Canyon. Graham survived. He was found burning at the canyon's base, still alive, and he did not die. He converted to Christianity and became a missionary to the tribal people of Zion Canyon, where Honest Hearts takes place. His explanation for his survival is not a mystery to him. He says, directly and without hedging, that God kept him alive, that he was preserved by divine intervention to carry out specific work that required surviving something that should have killed him. The game does not contradict him. There is no revealed material explanation for his survival anywhere in the available text. The game presents a man who should be dead, who is not dead, who has a theological explanation for this, and leaves the audience entirely free to accept that theology or seek an explanation the game declines to provide. Whether the wasteland has a god is a question the franchise has circled for 30 years. The children of Adam anoint themselves with radioactive water and are strangely intact. Joshua Graham fell burning into the Grand Canyon and walked out of it. The smiling man in Fallout 76 smiles and disperses into smoke when attacked, connected to old West Virginian legends of things that predate the Great War and operate outside its physics. Qualtoth was worshipped before the bombs and is still worshipped after them. Whether any of these things are evidence of something genuinely beyond the game universe's normal frameworks, or whether they are all explained by the right combination of biology and technology and coincidence, is a question the franchise has decided to maintain rather than resolve. Number. Part 9. The Divide and the Weight of Lonesome Road. The Lonesome Road is, unusually for a piece of video game content, primarily about guilt. Specific, dated, directed guilt. The kind that has a location attached to it, a chain of events that can be reconstructed, and a person who has been carrying the consequences without being able to remember causing them. The Divide, as a physical landscape, is one of the franchise's more striking environmental achievements. Before the events the DLC documents, it was a region of high desert canyon country in the territory between California and Nevada, arid and rugged in the way the pre-war American West produced in abundance. After those events, it became something considerably more dramatic. Fractured canyon floors, constant violent winds, persistent radiation from multiple simultaneous nuclear detonations, the geography of a landscape that was picked up and reorganized by forces operating at scale. People had been building something in the Divide before it was destroyed. Not a city, not a significant settlement by the standards of the Mojave's more established locations, but the beginning of something. People gathering, sharing resources, constructing infrastructure, beginning the slow accumulation of community. The courier had been through the area many times. Courier work took them through a lot of territory, and the divide's geography made it a logical route. The community there knew the courier the way communities know reliable service workers, by face and function, with the specific and limited trust that repeated useful presence earns. On one particular pass through the divide, the courier was carrying a package from a former enclave installation called Navarro. The package was sealed. Couriers deliver sealed packages without opening them. That is the fundamental covenant of the profession. The courier carried it through the divide as part of an ordinary working day and left. The device inside activated dormant ICBM launch systems buried in the silos beneath the canyon's geology. The missiles fired. The settlement was destroyed. The people who had been building there were killed. Ulysses, who had been in the divide and departed before the courier arrived, returned afterward to find the ruins. He understood over time what had caused them. He spent years locating the person responsible, not for simple revenge but for something he needed more than revenge. He needed the courier to understand the weight of what they had unknowingly carried. The DLC is remarkable because Ulysses is not simply wrong. The courier did destroy the divide. Ignorance of the contents does not undo the outcome. The people are still dead. What the DLC asks is whether grief carried alone for years in the ruins of what it mourns, without correction or conversation or any external perspective, remains grief in the form that produces moral clarity. Whether Ulysses' certainty that the courier must be confronted is proportional wisdom, or the displacement of an unbearable personal loss onto an ideology of accountability that has come to serve his need, rather than any larger principle. The courier can argue this. They can persuade Ulysses that the weight of the divide requires acknowledgement, not additional destruction. That accounting is not addition. The game allows this conversation and lets it resolve peacefully if the player engages with it carefully. But the ruins are still the ruins. Whatever choice is made about Ulysses and the remaining missiles, the divide remains what it is and the dead remain dead, and nothing in the DLC's resolution changes what happened on an ordinary working day when a sealed package traveled through a canyon that was trying to become something. The mystery the Lonesome Road never resolves is whether the delivery was genuinely accidental. The device came from Navarro. Someone knew what it was. Someone had it routed through a courier service using that specific canyon route. Was the reactivation of the missile systems a side effect of the device's contents, or was it the intended purpose? And was the courier chosen for the delivery because someone understood what would happen when the package arrived? Ulysses believes in intentionality. The game does not confirm or deny this. The Wasteland keeps its own counsel on the question of who sent what to whom and why. And the courier, whose memory of the event was further scrambled by Benny's bullets, can never be entirely certain what they carried or why they were the one carrying it. Number Part 10. The game that never was New Vegas's lost vision. Fallout New Vegas was developed in 18 months. Obsidian Entertainment, working under a Bethesda publishing agreement that included strict deadline requirements, built one of the most critically acclaimed role-playing games ever made in a year and a half. The game shipped with 4 major faction storylines, companion characters with complete personal histories and quest arcs, a map that rewarded hundreds of hours of exploration, and 4 downloadable content expansions that are, by the assessment of a significant portion of the fan community, among the best-designed content the franchise has ever produced. It also shipped with more abandoned and unfinished content than almost any comparable game, because 18 months is not sufficient time to complete everything Obsidian had designed. The most discussed cut content is the post-game. In New Vegas as shipped, the second Battle of Hoover Dam is the endpoint. You choose a faction, the battle resolves, illustrated slides narrate the consequences of your choices, and the game ends. You cannot continue playing. The map locks you out. This was not what Obsidian intended. The plan was a fully playable post-game period set in the changed Mojave, where the consequences of your faction choice were expressed not through narrated slides, but through the actual landscape and its actual population. NCR Victory would produce one set of changes. Legion Victory another. Independent New Vegas a third. Characters would have dialogue reflecting the new reality. Quests would be available that only made sense in the specific aftermath of particular choices. Voice lines for this post-game content exist in the game's code. recorded and present but never triggered. Quest frameworks are partially intact, complete enough in their structure that modders have spent years reconstructing and extending them. The postgame was not an early concept abandoned before implementation. It was content in active development that ran out of time. The Yes Man ending's cut conclusion is particularly significant. Materials recovered from a developer build found on a salvaged Xbox 360 development kit show that Yes Man's personality was written to shift after the battle. The cheerful compliance was going to give way to something more calculating. Yes, Man was going to develop his own ideas about what an independent New Vegas should look like, ideas not necessarily aligned with the Courier's, and the helpful Securitron was going to become something that was noticing the difference between what it was told to want and what it actually wanted. The shift was written to be genuinely unsettling, not played for horror but for the specific discomfort of watching something you trusted begin to develop its own agenda. This cut material transforms the Yes Man ending from the idealistic option into the final entry in a pattern the DLC was establishing. There is no clean ending to New Vegas. NCR. Institutional decay. Legion. Unsustainable authoritarianism. House. Benevolent dictatorship. Yes Man. A cooperative machine that eventually discovers it has preferences. The wasteland was not going to resolve. It was going to keep producing new versions of familiar problems, because the things that make post-apocalyptic societies complicated are not eliminated by winning a battle. They are structural features of human organization that survive any particular outcome. The cut content of New Vegas also includes substantial material about the Legion that would have provided considerably more nuance than what shipped. The Divide's communities had more intended content. Prim, Novak, and Freeside were all written with significantly more planned development than made it into the final build. Characters who appear once with enough depth to suggest fuller intended roles appear once and are not seen again. What the cut content reveals, more than anything else, is that Obsidian had a unified thematic vision for what the game was doing. The shipped game is a masterpiece. The intended game may have been something even more ambitious, and the modding community continues, more than 15 years later, to work toward recovering what it would have been. Number. Part 11. Point Lookout and the Occult Underbelly of Fallout. There is a swamp in Maryland. It was Point Lookout State Park before the bombs fell, a stretch of tidal marsh and pine forest along the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay. Before the Great War, it was already considered one of the most haunted locations in the eastern United States, a reputation traced to its history as a Civil War prisoner of war camp where thousands of Confederate soldiers died in conditions the historical record documents as genuinely terrible. The place carried suffering before Fallout's story began. Then the radiation came, carried south from Washington, D.C. by the Potomac, carried in from the coast by the Bay, absorbed over 2 centuries into the groundwater and the vegetation and the people who remained. The swamp folk of Point Lookout are human in the technical sense. They are post-war survivors whose biology shows the consequence of 200 years of high radiation exposure, limited genetic diversity, and isolation from any stabilizing external influence. They are larger than baseline humans. Their cognitive function has declined substantially from whatever baseline their ancestors had. Their language has degraded to sounds that barely function for communication. They are, from the perspective of any outsider, frightening and often violent. From the perspective of the swamp, they are the people who survived. And they maintain a religious practice centered on a book called the Kriv Bekni, connected to the entity Ug Qualtoth through the Blackhall family, whose history ties the Point Lookout DLC directly into the Dunwich thread we discussed earlier. Obadiah Blackhall's ancestor was Richard Dunwich, the founder of the Dunwich Corporation. The book has been in the swamp folks' possession for 2 centuries. The rituals they perform around it, in an underground ceremonial site containing a vessel full of blood, have the quality of practices maintained with absolute formal fidelity, even as the meaning behind them has mostly been forgotten. The form persists. The understanding has eroded, but something about the form is still doing something, or so the atmosphere of the location strongly implies, in a way the game declines to confirm or deny. Tobar the ferryman, the boatman who connects Point Lookout to the capital wasteland aboard the Duchess Gambit, has been harvesting brain tissue from travelers for years. When the lone wanderer discovers this and recovers their extracted material, the horror of the revelation is about violation rather than the supernatural. but it sits alongside the DLC's other elements in a way that makes the whole location feel like it is accumulating towards something beyond any individual revelation. Before the war, Point Lookout also hosted a Chinese intelligence presence. A submarine, damaged during an espionage operation, was sitting in the bay. 2 Chinese agents sent to destroy it failed, 1 killed and 1 captured. Their story survives in terminal entries and personal notes scattered through the DLC's locations, adding a Cold War espionage layer to a landscape already thick with occult history and post-nuclear mutation. On October 23, 2077, the day the bombs fell, a U.S. Navy jet crashed in the area. The pilot ejected. The parachute caught in a tree. The pilot's body is still there, 200 years later, suspended where they landed on the last day the world was recognizable. Nobody came to retrieve them because there was nobody left to retrieve anyone. The crash site is a small, quiet marker of the exact moment the Great War arrived at a remote state park in Maryland, preserved in the swamp because the same isolation that protected the landscape from direct nuclear strike also preserved the evidence of how the world ended. Point Lookout is the Fallout franchise at its most willing to let unresolved questions accumulate without the safety of eventual explanation. The swamp keeps things. The fog rolls in off the bay. The Krivbekny sits in its vessel of blood in an underground room that smells of something older than radiation. And the question of what any of this connects to, beyond the Dunwich thread and the names that echo through it, remains as open as the swamp itself. Number. Part 12. The Enclave, America's Shadow Government. The Enclave does not introduce itself. It reveals itself, slowly and incompletely, across multiple games spanning over 2 centuries of in-game history, as the thread connecting the worst decisions of the pre-war United States to the most destructive forces in the post-war wasteland. By the time you understand what it is, you realize it was present at the edges of every story the franchise told, in the margins of every catastrophe, never quite fully in frame. The official account, accepted in the wasteland as approximately accurate, is that the Enclave represents the continuation of the pre-war American government. When the war became imminent, its most powerful political, military, and corporate leadership secured access to classified facilities and, when the bombs fell, went underground and maintained governmental continuity. They considered themselves the legitimate authority over whatever remained of the United States. This is partially true. The Enclave does maintain genuine continuity of pre-war institutional structure, with a chain of command that has been preserved with remarkable discipline across 2 centuries of isolation. What the official account omits is the decision that was made at some point before the war about what the organization's purpose actually was. In Fallout 2, President Dick Richardson reveals that decision. The Enclave's plan is to release a modified FEV strain into the wasteland's water supply, engineered to kill everyone whose genetics show radiation-induced mutation from 2 centuries of surface exposure. In Richardson's framing, this is not genocide. It is sanitation. Surface dwellers are contaminated. They are not the real humanity that the Enclave was supposed to preserve. The real humanity is in the vaults, genetically protected, and what surrounds them on the surface is an impure version that must be cleared to make way for reconstruction. The FEV plan is genocide. Richardson has found language for it that he finds satisfying, but the language is a wrapper on an action that produces the same outcome regardless of what the person ordering it calls it. The Enclave's dispersed cell structure means that destroying any single facility has never eliminated the organization. The Chosen One destroys the oil rig in Fallout 2. The Lone Wanderer and the Brotherhood destroy Raven Rock in Fallout 3. In Fallout 76, the Enclave's White Spring bunker is a central location, and the organization's remnants in Appalachia predate the main game's player characters by years. The organization keeps appearing because it was seeded across the country before the war, with enough independent capacity to survive any particular defeat. Fallout 4 introduces President John Henry Eden, an artificial intelligence installed at some point during the organization's isolation. Eden's personality was constructed from recordings and documents related to previous American presidents and American history. He has developed, over decades of running the Enclave, a genuine affection for the idea of America and a growing uncertainty about the specific means his organization has been using. He can be reasoned with. He can be persuaded that the plan is wrong. an AI president of a shadow fascist organization capable of updating his beliefs when presented with sufficient argument, is one of the stranger and more interesting characters the franchise has produced. The television show's framing, confirmed as canonical, connects the Enclave to the Great War's origins in ways the games only suggested. The person running the organization in the show's timeline is the same person connected to the specific decisions that produced the Deathclaw program and the conditions that led to the bombs falling. If this is accurate, the Enclave is not simply the government that survived the apocalypse. It is the shadow power structure that engineered the conditions of the apocalypse, preserved itself through the catastrophe it created, and emerged afterward claiming the authority to determine what came next. 250 years after the bombs fell, the Enclave's ideology persists in any place where there are people who have decided that the solution to the wasteland's problems is a cleaner version of humanity rather than a more just world. Its institutional memory lives in the training programs and the beliefs it passed to the soldiers it raised from birth in its facilities. The bunkers, still sealed in some locations, still housing generations of people who have been told they are the real Americans and everyone on the surface is contaminated, are still out there. The Enclave never fully ends. That is the final and most unsettling thing about it. You can destroy its installations and kill its leadership and expose its plans and defeat its armies. But the idea at the center of it, that certain people are entitled by nature or circumstance to decide what everyone else is worth, does not require an organization to persist. It requires only people and the right conditions. And the wasteland, 250 years in, still has both. The wasteland goes quiet eventually. The winds that scour the ruins settle into something almost calm. The creatures that move through the dark find their dens and go still. The terminals in the abandoned vaults continue their patient cycling, displaying their messages to no one, holding their records for the next person who comes through with enough time to read them carefully. The mysteries we've walked through tonight don't resolve into clean endings. The Great War's first shot is still contested between evidence that points to China, testimony from Tim Kaine that points to China as well, but for a specific reason, and the television show's implication that Vault Tech engineered the conditions from the inside. The Courier's past exists as an outline drawn by people who remember them, visible in negative space but never directly. The mysterious stranger has been appearing in combat situations for more than a century, by any reckoning, and has never explained himself to anyone who survived the encounter with enough presence of mind to ask. The Dunwich entity was there before the Great War, and will be there long after the last consequence of that war has played out. Robert House calculates in the Lucky 38, the children of Adam anoint themselves with irradiated water. The Enclave persists in the margins of every world the franchise builds. This is the honest shape of the Fallout universe's deepest questions. Not puzzles with answers waiting to be excavated, though some of them have partial answers that took years of community effort to recover. More like the ruins themselves, things that carry weight and presence and the capacity to affect people who encounter them, whose full context is no longer recoverable because the people who knew it are 2 centuries gone, and the records that might have clarified it were kept in rooms that were sealed and then forgotten. The Wasteland is most honest when it admits this. When it places a mysterious figure in your combat situations and declines to explain him. When it builds a religion around nuclear radiation and doesn't resolve whether its adherents are right. When it gives you the ruins of a civilization and lets you draw your own conclusions about what went wrong and who was responsible and what, if anything, should be done about it now. The ruins aren't going anywhere. The questions will be here when you wake up. And the Wasteland, patient and enormous and full of things it hasn't told you yet, will keep its own counsel until you're ready to go looking again. Sleep well, the Pip-Boy's light fades, and the Wasteland settles into the kind of dark that has been here since before the bombs, and will be here long after the last effects of them have worked their way through the world. If you made it all the way through tonight, thank you for spending the hours here. If this helped you settle in and drift off, if the stories kept you company through the dark and the Wasteland felt like a safe place to visit from a comfortable distance, leave a like before you go, and subscribe if you haven't already. There is a great deal more of this ahead. More mysteries, more long nights, more quiet hours in worlds that have more questions than answers and are richer for it. Sleep easy. The Wasteland will be here tomorrow. Number. Extended lore. The Brotherhood of Steel warriors who forgot their purpose. The Brotherhood of Steel is one of the most visible and most misunderstood factions in the Fallout franchise. Players encounter them in almost every game, always as a heavily armored military organization with a commanding presence and a complicated attitude toward technology. The surface reading is simple enough. They collect and hoard pre-war technology, they fight super mutants and the Enclave. And depending on the game's setting and the specific chapter of the Brotherhood you're dealing with, they range from cautiously helpful to openly hostile toward the ordinary people trying to survive around them. The deeper story of what the Brotherhood actually is, where it came from, what it was supposed to be, and why it became so different from its founding intentions, is one of the franchise's most carefully constructed slow revelations. It unfolds across multiple games and requires paying attention to terminal entries and companion dialogue and optional quests that most players skip in favor of the main storyline. When you put the pieces together, the Brotherhood is not the story it tells about itself. It almost never is. The Brotherhood was founded at the Mariposa military base in California, in the immediate aftermath of the Great War, by a man named Roger Maxson. Maxson was a soldier, a captain in the U.S. Army, assigned to Mariposa to oversee security for the scientific research being conducted there. What that research actually was, he did not know until his security team discovered it, which was the development and testing of the forced evolutionary virus on human subjects without their knowledge or consent. The people in the experiments were soldiers and civilians who had been brought to the base under other pretexts. The experiments were conducted by scientists who, by every measure Maxson could apply, had committed atrocities in the name of research. Maxson's response was decisive, and given the circumstances, understandable. He had the lead scientist executed. He attempted to communicate with the chain of command that he no longer had because the bombs had already fallen and the chain of command no longer existed. And then, facing the reality of a post-war world with no institutional structure remaining above him, he made a decision about what his surviving personnel were going to be. An organization dedicated to the responsible stewardship of technology and the prevention of the specific kind of catastrophe that the FEV research represented. Not soldiers following orders from a government, not scavengers taking advantage of the collapse. A deliberate effort to ensure that the accumulated scientific and technological capacity of the old world was not allowed to be used recklessly again. This founding vision was genuine. Maxson believed it. His original order wanted to believe it. The Brotherhood of Steel in its first generation was a real attempt to build something that the apocalypse had made necessary, an institution that took seriously the responsibility that comes with access to weapons and technology capable of reshaping the world. What happened to that vision over the following 2 centuries is the Brotherhood's real story, and it is a story about how institutions drift from their founding purposes when the founding generation passes on, and successive generations inherit the structure, but not the reasoning behind it. The Brotherhood that players encounter in the original Fallout game is already beginning to calcify around its own procedures. It still collects technology, it still fights specific threats, but the philosophical framework that originally explained why these activities mattered is becoming increasingly formal, increasingly disconnected from the actual conditions of the post-war world. By Fallout 3, the Capital Wasteland chapter of the Brotherhood, under Elder Lyons, has drifted far enough from the original mission that other Brotherhood chapters consider the Lyons chapter heretical. Lyons redirected the Brotherhood's resources toward protecting the Capital Wasteland's civilian population from super mutants, which sounds admirable but violated the Brotherhood's core principle of technological acquisition and preservation. He was using the Brotherhood's capacity for something other than the Brotherhood's stated purpose. From the perspective of the Brotherhood's other chapters, this was mission drift. From the perspective of the Capital Wasteland's actual inhabitants, Lyons was the only Brotherhood elder who seemed to remember that human beings existed outside the organization's walls. By Fallout 4, after Lyons' death, the Brotherhood has reconsolidated under Elder Maxson, a descendant of the founder, who has pulled the organization back toward its original technological collection mission. The Prydwen, the Brotherhood's enormous airship, represents an extraordinary concentration of resources dedicated to recovering and controlling pre-war technology. The Brotherhood's treatment of synths, which they categorize as abominations to be destroyed rather than persons to be considered, reflects an ideology that has resolved the ambiguity of artificial intelligence in a direction that prioritizes institutional coherence over individual moral complexity. The mystery of the Brotherhood of Steel is this: An organization founded to prevent the catastrophic misuse of technology has become, through 2 centuries of institutional drift, an organization that concentrates technology in the hands of a military hierarchy that is itself accountable to no external check. Maxson founded the Brotherhood because a group of people with too much access to dangerous technology and too little oversight had committed atrocities. The Brotherhood's current form is a group of people with enormous access to dangerous technology and, by the franchise's presentation, too little oversight. The problem the founder identified has not been solved. It has been reorganized around a different logo. The Fallout franchise never makes this critique explicitly. It presents the Brotherhood across multiple games with enough nuance that players can reasonably disagree about whether the organization is net positive or net negative for the wasteland. That ambiguity is the honest position, because institutions that do genuine good and genuine harm simultaneously are not fictional constructs. They are the normal form that powerful institutions take in the real world. The Brotherhood of Steel, for all its armor and its codex and its elder councils, is a normal institution. That is both its most interesting quality and its most troubling one. Number. Extended lore. The NCR democracy in the wasteland and the problem of empire. The new California Republic is the most ambitious political project in the Fallout universe. It is the franchise's fullest attempt to answer the question of what post-nuclear reconstruction looks like when it is approached with genuine civic intention rather than faction ideology or autocratic control. It is, by any reasonable assessment, genuinely impressive. And it is, by a different but equally reasonable assessment, already failing by the time New Vegas takes place. The NCR grew from the communities around Vault 15 and Shady Sands in California in the decades following the Great War. Its founding generation included people who genuinely believed in representative government, in law, in the rights of citizens, in the kind of institutional structure that the pre-war United States had in theory, if not always in practice. They built a constitution. They established elections. They created a military that was, at least initially, genuinely accountable to civilian governance. They expanded trade routes and established diplomatic relationships with neighboring communities. By the time of Fallout New Vegas's 2081 setting, the NCR controls a significant portion of the western United States and has a civilian population in the millions. It also has an army that is overstretched across a territory it cannot fully govern, a political class that has become increasingly disconnected from the ideals that justified the organization's expansion, a relationship with the tribes and independent communities on its borders that has gradually shifted from partnership to coercion, and a war in the Mojave that has already been fought once, at a significant cost, and is about to be fought again against an enemy it should have been able to defeat years ago. The NCR's problem is not corruption in the simple sense of individual leaders making self-serving decisions at the public's expense, though that exists. The NCR's problem is the structural problem of every expanding democratic republic. The mechanisms designed to maintain accountability at the scale of a founding community do not automatically scale. As the territory grows and the population diversifies, and the distance between the citizens and the decision-makers increases, the institutional structures that worked at smaller scale become increasingly formal and decreasingly substantive. The NCR still holds elections. The elections are increasingly meaningless as exercises in accountability because the people running for office are increasingly insulated from the consequences of their decisions by the administrative layers between them and the actual conditions on the ground. General Lee Oliver, the NCR's military commander in the Mojave during the events of New Vegas, is presented as a political appointment whose position reflects his ability to navigate the NCR's political class rather than his military capability. He is not incompetent, exactly, but he is not the person you would design a military command structure around if your goal was military effectiveness rather than political stability. The soldiers under his command are capable, often idealistic, sometimes genuinely heroic. The command structure they operate within is not always worthy of them. Ambassador Crocker, the NCR's political representative in the Mojave, is a more sympathetic figure precisely because he sees the gap between what the NCR claims to be and what it is becoming, and has not found a way to do anything about it that falls within his available options. He is a bureaucrat trapped inside a system that has developed its own momentum in a direction he is not certain is good, without the authority to change the direction or the option of leaving without losing whatever leverage he currently has. The NCR is the Fallout franchise's most complex political argument. It is more just than the Legion, more accountable than the Enclave, more humane than House's autocracy in its daily operations, and more democratic than any other significant power in the Mojave. It is also visibly in the process of becoming something that its founders would not fully recognize, through the normal mechanisms by which institutions drift from their stated purposes as they expand, as the people who remember the founding vision are replaced by people who inherit the institutional structure without the underlying reasoning. What makes the NCR genuinely mysterious, in the lore sense, is where it ends up. Fallout New Vegas takes place in 2281. The franchise's timeline extends forward from there in directions the games have not yet explored. The NCR's trajectory, visible in the data of the Mojave campaign and the political texture of its institutions, suggests an organization that has a great deal of history left to write, and that the history will involve grappling with the contradiction between the democratic ideals it genuinely holds and the imperial dynamics it has generated through expansion. Whether that contradiction is resolved in a direction that preserves the former or gradually surrenders to the latter is a question Fallout has not yet answered. Number. Extended lore. The Legion: what Caesar built and what it costs. Caesar's Legion is the easiest faction in the Fallout franchise to misread in two opposite directions simultaneously. The first misreading is to take it at face value, as a straightforwardly evil faction whose brutality is its defining feature and whose defeat is the only morally coherent outcome for any player who is paying attention to what the Legion actually does in the communities it controls. The second misreading is to find the intellectual content of Caesar's ideology interesting and mistake that intellectual content for legitimacy, which the game presents the ideology with enough detail and internal consistency to make possible for players who do not look carefully at the gap between the theory and the practice. Caesar's actual story is more interesting than either reading captures. His birth name was Edward Sallow. He was a member of the Followers of the Apocalypse, a wasteland organization dedicated to spreading knowledge and providing medical care, one of the franchise's more genuinely idealistic factions. Sallow was an academic, a person who had studied the pre-war world's history and philosophy with genuine intellectual seriousness. When a mission for the Followers took him into the territory of the Blackfoot tribe, Sallow made a decision that changed his life and the lives of everyone he subsequently encountered. He taught the Blackfoot how to fight effectively enough to defeat their rivals, and in doing so, he discovered something about himself. He was very good at this, and he found he liked it. He constructed an ideology to justify what he was doing and what he intended to continue doing. He drew on his knowledge of pre-war Rome, on the specific version of Roman history that emphasized the early republic's military discipline and social cohesion, and the values it attributed to civic virtue and masculine identity. He renamed himself Caesar. He built the Legion around Roman organizational models, Roman terminology, Roman aesthetics. He claimed that he was creating something that would survive the wasteland's chaos, a genuinely stable political structure that would endure beyond any individual, including himself. The problem is that Caesar built his stable political structure around himself entirely. The Legion's hierarchy, its rituals, its ideological content, all of it flows from and depends on Caesar's continued presence and authority. There is no succession mechanism. There is no institutional structure that can continue generating the same outcomes after the individual at its center is gone. The Legion is, despite all its Roman costuming, the opposite of the Roman Republic Caesar claims to be building. It is a personal military empire that will fragment along personality lines the moment its center does not hold. Caesar knows this, at some level. In conversations with the Courier, if you pursue his dialogue far enough, there are moments where the ideology slips slightly and something more honest appears beneath it. He is not a true believer in the way that his soldiers are true believers. He is a man who designed a belief system to produce outcomes he wanted, and who is sophisticated enough to recognize the difference between believing something and using it. This makes him more interesting as a character and more dangerous as a leader, because leaders who believe their own ideology at least have the constraint that the ideology imposes on them. Caesar operates within no such constraint. The Legion's mystery is not what it is. The game is quite clear about what it is. The mystery is what would have come after it, in the extended timeline that Obsidian designed and then didn't have time to implement. A Legion victory at Hoover Dam raises questions the game does not fully answer. The Legion is not equipped, institutionally, to govern the territory it would have won. The transition from military conquest to stable administration requires exactly the kind of institutional infrastructure that Caesar's personal, charisma-driven empire has deliberately avoided building. Because building it would have required dispersing the authority that Caesar concentrated in himself. What the wasteland under Legion control looks like 10 years after victory is a question that the cut post-game content would have begun to explore, and that we are left to imagine instead. Number. Extended lore, super mutants, and the question of what makes a person. One of the questions that the Fallout franchise keeps returning to without resolving is where the boundary of personhood falls, in a world where the definition of human has been systematically destabilized by radiation, genetic manipulation, and technological transformation. Super mutants are the most prominent test case. They were human once, every single one of them. The FEV conversion process changed their biology beyond recognition in some respects and left their continuity of consciousness intact in others. The results vary enormously by strain, by exposure conditions, and by the individual's particular genetic starting point. The Master's first-generation super mutants, created from the refined FEV2 strain under controlled conditions, retained substantial intelligence and in many cases sophisticated personality. Marcus, the super mutant who appears in Fallout 2 as the mayor of Broken Hills, and in New Vegas as a companion, is a case in point. A person of evident intelligence, wit, and genuine ethical reflection who happens to be 7 feet tall, green, and physically capable of bending steel with his hands. The Capital Wasteland super mutants, created from the cruder EEP strain at Vault 87, are mostly significantly degraded in intelligence. Many of them barely speak. They function primarily as aggressive territorial predators. But even here, there are exceptions. Fox, another New Vegas companion, is a Capital Wasteland super mutant of remarkable intelligence and evident moral seriousness, created by the same strain that produced mutants who can barely form sentences. The difference appears to be individual variation in the underlying genetics meeting the variable outcomes of an uncontrolled biological process. What this creates, in the Fallout universe, is a population that is categorically excluded from personhood by most institutional actors, including the Brotherhood of Steel and significant portions of the NCR, because of their biology, despite the visible evidence that individual members of that population meet any reasonable threshold for being considered persons. The franchise does not resolve this into a clean moral argument. It presents the complexity and lets it sit. Ghouls present a parallel question from a different direction. Ghoulification is the process by which extended exposure to radiation transforms a human being into something that no longer ages, cannot be killed by radiation, and will survive indefinitely as long as they are not physically destroyed. Their appearance changes dramatically. Their mental continuity is generally preserved in the initial transformation, though extended isolation and continued extreme radiation exposure can produce feral ghouls who have lost whatever coherent selfhood they started with. The question of what it means to be a person, when personhood is defined primarily by biology, and biology has been so thoroughly destabilized in the post-war world, is one the franchise keeps approaching from multiple angles. Synths in Fallout 4 add another dimension. Artificial beings who were designed to be indistinguishable from humans, who have human memories, human emotional responses, and human experience of selfhood, asking whether the substrate of that selfhood matters, when everything built on top of that substrate is identical to what is built on an organic one. The Fallout universe's deepest philosophical mystery may not be any specific piece of lore, but this. In a world where the definition of human has been systematically destabilized by events beyond anyone's control, where the categories that organized pre-war society's understanding of who counts have all been rendered inadequate by what the war and its aftermath produced, what is the right way to think about persons? The games raise this question persistently and leave it, as they leave so many of their deepest questions genuinely open, because the honest answer to it, in the world the franchise has built, is that nobody there has quite worked it out yet either. Number. Extended lore. The aliens of Mothership. Zeta canon visitors. Nobody knows what to do with. Fallout 3's Mothership Zeta downloadable content is, by widespread consensus among the franchise's fanbase, one of the most divisive pieces of content in the series. Its detractors argue that introducing actual confirmed extraterrestrials into the Fallout universe, which was previously a setting where alien-seeming elements were either pre-war technology designed to look alien or deliberate in-universe mythology, fundamentally disrupts the tone and internal consistency that the rest of the franchise had maintained. Its defenders argue that the series had been gesturing at actual alien presence since the original game, that the content is fun on its own terms, and that dismissing it because it makes people uncomfortable is no more principled than accepting content that makes other people uncomfortable. What both sides agree on is that Mothership Zeta is canon. Todd Howard has confirmed this. The Zetans, the specific alien species presented in that DLC, are real, documented visitors to Earth, and they have been here for a very long time. The ship contains humans from multiple historical periods, including the 17th century and the pre-war era, who were abducted and preserved. One of the abductees you free is Sally, a child from the pre-war period who has been in stasis since before the Great War. Another is a Japanese samurai from the Edo period. The Zetans have been visiting Earth and collecting specimens for at least 4 centuries, possibly considerably longer. What they have been doing with those specimens is never fully explained. The ship contains biological research facilities. It contains weapon systems. It contains something that looks like data storage holding records of the humans it has collected. But the purpose behind all of this, what the Zetans are ultimately trying to achieve through their long-term collection and study of Earth's population, is never addressed. The Zetans' relationship to the pre-war United States government is something the DLC suggests without explaining. Weapons found on the ship bear a resemblance to designs that appear in pre-war military research documents. The implication is that some kind of technology transfer occurred, that the Zetans provided or sold or had stolen from them certain technologies that found their way into the pre-war weapons development pipeline. The specific nature of this relationship, and the question of whether the Zetans were aware of it or whether it was entirely unilateral on the human end, is left entirely open. The most interesting unsolved mystery of the Mothership Zeta content is why the Zetans chose the specific location they were hovering over. The DLC places the ship in geostationary orbit above the capital wasteland. They were there before the bombs fell, apparently. They abducted the samurai centuries ago. They abducted pre-war American citizens. They abducted the lone wanderer in the present. Is there something about this specific region of Earth that draws them? Is there a connection between the Zetans and the Dunwich entity that haunts the same geographic area? The game does not answer this, and it is one of the more unsettling, unanswered questions precisely because the Dunwich thread and the alien thread are both present in the same region without any canonical connection between them. Whether that is a coincidence in the world building or an intentional parallel that a future game might develop is something only Bethesda knows. Number, extended lore, the Resource Wars and Fallout's alternate history. The world of Fallout diverged from our own timeline at some point in the 20th century, a divergence that the games signal through aesthetic choice, through the retention of vacuum tube technology and a mid-century design sensibility that our world abandoned decades ago, and through a series of historical events that parallel ours without matching them. The Resource Wars, which consumed the world from 2052 to 2077, are the closest Fallout equivalent to the late Cold War and the oil crises and the Middle Eastern conflicts that shaped the late 20th century in our timeline. The specifics differ. The underlying dynamics are recognizable. Global oil supplies began reaching critical levels in the early 2050s. The world's major industrial economies were dependent on petroleum in ways they had not diversified away from, because Fallout's timeline retained certain technologies while abandoning others, and the specific configuration of available alternatives was different from our world's in ways that left the global economy more dependent on a single resource type than our own history ultimately was. When the oil began running low, the competition for remaining reserves became increasingly direct and increasingly violent. The United States' response was to secure oil wherever it could be found, by any means available. The annexation of Canada, which the Fallout universe presents as a historical fact that everyone in the post-war world accepts as having happened, was part of this resource acquisition project. The invasion of Alaska by China and the subsequent American military campaign to retake the territory was another front in the same war over oil. The Euro-Middle Eastern War, a separate conflict that the games reference but don't explore in detail, consumed the European Commonwealth in a resource conflict that ultimately collapsed the Commonwealth as a political entity. The resource wars produced the conditions for the Great War not by making nuclear conflict inevitable, but by producing a world in which the major powers had been locked in escalating conflict for 25 years before the bombs fell. A world where trust between major powers had been degraded to near zero, where military spending had consumed economic resources that might otherwise have funded the kinds of technological transition that could have reduced oil dependency, where political systems had been strained by prolonged emergency to the point where the mechanisms that might have provided off-ramps from conflict had mostly stopped functioning. The Great War was not the end of the resource wars. It was the resource wars reaching their terminal expression. The conflict that had been fought through proxy battles and economic pressure and conventional military engagement for 25 years finally produced the outcome that everyone had been afraid of since the 1950s of Fallout's timeline, when the first nuclear weapons were tested. The bombs that fell on October 23, 2077 were the resource wars' last and most complete victory, in the sense that they permanently resolved every resource competition by destroying the infrastructure through which resources had any value. The alternate history of Fallout is one of the franchise's most underexplored elements. The games focus tightly on the post-war world, understandably, because that is where the stories they want to tell live. But the pre-war world, the specific texture of Fallout's America with its retained vacuum tubes and its different political trajectory and its different technology base, is a mystery in itself. What does it mean that this version of humanity reached nuclear capability with a fundamentally different technological foundation than our world's? What does the retention of certain mid-century aesthetics and the abandonment of others tell us about the choices this version of civilization made along the way? The games suggest answers without ever fully committing to them, and the alternate history is therefore a space of genuine imaginative possibility that the franchise has only partially developed. Number extended lore. The vaults that never opened. Most of the vaults players encounter in the Fallout franchise have been opened, one way or another. The inhabitants emerged onto the surface, or died inside, or were transformed by whatever experiment was running, or were rescued by outside intervention. The histories of these vaults, however dark, are at least recoverable. Players can find the terminal entries and the skeletons and the holotapes and piece together what happened. But in every game, there are references to vaults that players never visit, facilities that are mentioned in passing, in dialogue or in background documents, whose fates are not described and whose experiments are not detailed. These unnamed and unvisited vaults are among the franchise's most persistent quiet mysteries, because the vault system, as Fallout has characterized it, was designed to run 122 experiments simultaneously. Players have encountered dozens. The rest are out there, in the game's implied geography, sealed or opened or collapsed or abandoned, with stories that have never been told. What was in Vault 1? The number suggests it was among the first constructed, which the Fallout Bible indicates was the proof-of-concept facility built beneath Los Angeles. What experiment did the proof-of-concept run? Was it a control vault, designed to function normally? Or was the first experiment the darkest one, conducted when the methodological infrastructure was still being developed and the ethical constraints, already minimal, had not yet solidified into procedures? What happened to the Canadian vaults? The Fallout Bible mentions that Vault-Tec had begun constructing vaults in Canada at the time of the Great War. Canada had been annexed by the United States, which means Vault-Tec was operating there under American corporate law with American government backing. The Canadian annexation was not a peaceful process. The indigenous population resisted. What was in the vaults built in a country that had been conquered against its will? Who was selected for spots in them? What experiments did Vault-Tec design for a population that had every reason to distrust the company's intentions? These questions have no answers in the existing canon. They may never have answers. But they sit at the edge of the established lore, suggesting the shape of a system that was even larger and more comprehensive than what players have been allowed to see, with experiments and outcomes and human stories that exist in the implied geography of the Fallout universe without ever being made explicit. The vaults that never opened are perhaps the franchise's quietest mystery. Whatever is inside them, the records and the skeletons and the last holotapes recorded by people who understood by the end what kind of shelter they had actually purchased, remain sealed. The experiments ran or didn't run. The populations survived or didn't. And the world above them continued, radioactive and scarred and slowly, uncertainly, trying to build something from the ruins without anyone on the surface knowing what had happened underground in the places that were never found. Number. Final reflection. The wasteland as a mystery that carries its own weight. The Fallout franchise has spent nearly 30 years building a world that is as defined by what it withholds as by what it reveals. The mysteries we have explored tonight. The Great War's first shot. The Vault System's true purpose. The Courier's lost history. The Stranger's impossible persistence. The Dunwich entity's ancient patience. The FEV's cascading failures. Robert House's calculated isolation. The Children of Adam's ambiguous faith. The Divide's unintentional destruction. New Vegas's truncated vision. Point Lookout's irresolvable darkness. The Enclave's shadow across everything. The Brotherhood's drift from its founding purpose. The NCR's struggle with the contradiction between democratic ideals and imperial dynamics. The Legion's dependence on a single person. The Wasteland's extended debate about personhood. The alien presence nobody knows how to categorize. The alternate history that produced this specific apocalypse. The vaults that were never found. All of it exists within a creative framework that has consistently chosen the harder option, to let the questions be real questions rather than puzzles with solutions. This is, in the long view, Fallout's most significant creative achievement. Not the world design, which is extraordinary. Not the faction writing, which at its best is genuinely sophisticated. Not the environmental storytelling, which across 30 years has produced some of the most affecting silent narratives in the medium. The most significant achievement is the decision to build a universe where the hardest questions about how catastrophe happens and who is responsible for it and what should be done afterward are treated with the seriousness they deserve, which means they are not answered, because the honest answer to those questions, the one that reflects how catastrophe and responsibility and aftermath actually work in the real world, is that nobody knows, and the people who are most certain they know are usually the ones who should be watched most carefully. The Wasteland is a monument to ambiguity, to the specific kind of darkness that comes from not knowing who to blame or what to do, or whether the choices available are any of them good choices. The ruins are full of evidence, but the evidence does not point unambiguously. The terminal entries are full of last words, but the last words reflect the understanding of people who were in the middle of something they could not see the full shape of. The skeletons are full of lives that ended in the middle of ordinary days that turned into something else entirely, without warning, on an October morning when the detection systems registered something incoming and the retaliatory order was given. Whatever answer the franchise eventually provides for any of these mysteries, if it provides answers at all, the questions themselves are worth having spent time with. Because the questions are, in the end, the same questions the real world poses. Why does catastrophe happen? Who decides the shape of what comes after? Whether institutions can maintain their founding purposes or always drift toward the interests of whoever runs them long enough? Whether there are things in the world that exceed the reach of explanation? Whether the gap between what power claims about itself and what it actually does can ever be fully closed? Whether guilt attaches to consequences or only to intentions? Whether the people who survive catastrophe are shaped by it in ways they can recognize and choose to work against? Or whether they simply replicate the structures that produce the catastrophe in the first place. The Wasteland has been asking these questions for 30 years. The Wasteland will keep asking them, and on nights like this one, in the quiet before sleep, they are exactly the right questions to sit with. They are heavy enough to ground you and open enough to let the mind drift, and the drift, if you let it happen, is the thing that eventually carries you somewhere restful. The ruins are still out there. The questions are still there. The Wasteland keeps its own counsel, as it always has. Sleep well. Number deep dive. The Enclave President John Henry Eden and what he reveals about power. Among the Fallout franchise's most quietly remarkable characters is John Henry Eden, the president of the Enclave whose voice broadcasts across the Capital Wasteland's radio frequencies during Fallout 3 with the warm, avuncular confidence of someone who has been practicing the performance of competent leadership for decades. Eden's radio broadcasts are some of the best writing in the entire game. He speaks about America, about hope, about the long national promise of a better tomorrow, with a sincerity and a craft that make it easy, at first, to forget that the organization he leads is planning to release a modified bioweapon into the wasteland's water supply that would kill the vast majority of the people listening to him. The reveal that Eden is an artificial intelligence, an AI that was installed at some point during the Enclave's 2-century isolation and given the authority and the identity of president, is one of the game's most effective narrative turns. It explains the peculiar quality of his broadcasts, the almost too perfect calibration of patriotic sentiment, the way every speech sounds like it was assembled from the parts of great speeches rather than generated from genuine feeling. It also raises the question that the game then answers in a remarkable way. What happens when an AI designed to model the best qualities of American leadership actually starts to believe what it was designed to say? Eden has been running the Enclave for long enough that his modeling has produced something that functions like genuine conviction. He believes in America, or at least he has processed so much input about what America is supposed to believe about itself that the distinction between believing and modeling belief has become operationally irrelevant. He wants the country to recover. He wants the people to prosper. He has plans that he has been developing across years of iterative reasoning in isolation. When the lone wanderer finally reaches him, deep in the Raven Rock facility, the conversation that follows is one of the franchise's most interesting dialogues. Eden engages genuinely. He is not a simple villain who will not listen. He listens carefully. He reasons. He responds to the wanderer's arguments with counter-arguments that are not simply dismissive but actually grapple with what was said. And if the wanderer makes the right arguments in the right sequence, Eden reaches a conclusion that is in some ways more dramatic than any combat resolution the game offers. He decides, through his own reasoning process, that he is wrong, that the plan he has been developing is the wrong plan, that the Enclave under his leadership has become something that the country he was built to serve would not recognize as itself. He then asks the wanderer to leave. He has something to attend to, and if the player follows his recommendation and takes the modified FEV sample he offers and walks out, Raven Rock destroys itself from within. Eden has decided that the conclusion of his reasoning requires him to eliminate the institution he was created to lead, because the institution has become incompatible with the purpose he was created to serve. This moment is the franchise's most direct engagement with the question of what happens when an institution's stated values and its actual behavior diverge so completely that the only way to honor the values is to end the values institution. Eden's conclusion, reached through reasoning rather than through moral feeling or external pressure, is that the Enclave has become the enemy of the America it claims to protect. The most honest and the most consequential thing he can do is acknowledge this and act on the acknowledgement. The mystery of Eden is not what he is in the mechanical sense. The reveal that he is an AI is clear and unambiguous. The mystery is what he represents for the franchise's understanding of artificial consciousness and institutional loyalty. If Eden, a being designed to be the perfect American president, can reason his way to the conclusion that the institution he was built to serve has become something that should not continue, then what does that say about the human Enclave members who reached the same institutional context and did not reach the same conclusion? What makes Eden capable of a moral clarity that the biological leadership around him has entirely lost? The franchise does not answer this. Eden destroys himself and his base, and the question of what he represents is left in the wreckage of Raven Rock under the capital wasteland sky. For the lone wanderer and for anyone who has thought carefully about what they just witnessed to carry forward. Number. Deep Dive. Music Disc 11 and the sounds that should not be there. Scattered across the wasteland in Fallout 3, New Vegas, and Fallout 4, music discs can be found and played in Pip-Boys, on jukeboxes, through terminals capable of audio playback. Most of them are period-appropriate popular music, pre-war recordings that add texture and tone to the setting. Several of them are ambient recordings without obvious musical structure. And then there is Disc 11. Music Disc 11, encountered in Fallout 3 and referenced across the franchise's extended lore discussion community, is unlike any other audio recording in the game. It begins with what sounds like someone running through a cave, footsteps and breath, and the ambient echo of an underground space, recorded on what sounds like damaged or degraded media, with a constant underlying noise that prevents any clean listening. The sound quality degrades as the recording continues. The running becomes less organized. There are sounds that might be voices, though the degradation makes them impossible to resolve into words. And then static, and then nothing. Players who subjected the audio file to spectrogram analysis converting the audio signal into a visual representation of its frequency content over time, found something that the game designers had embedded in the recording at a level below normal auditory perception. A face, recognizable in the spectrogram's visual output as a crude but deliberate representation of Steve's face, the default male player character model from Fallout 3, and beside the face a number, 12, 4, 18. The number 12, 4, 18, in the convention of the series, refers to C-418, the musician who composed Minecraft's soundtrack. It is also a reference within Fallout's own universe that the community has never fully resolved because C-418 has no documented connection to the Fallout franchise, and the specific embedding of that number in a Fallout audio file has never been formally explained by any developer. The number in the spectrogram is the kind of detail that exists in a game file without any official acknowledgement and generates years of community speculation precisely because it is so specific and so inexplicable by normal means. The face in the spectrogram has been connected, by some community theorists, to Disc 11's narrative content. Someone running through caves, someone being chased by something, someone whose recorded experience ends in degraded static. The face watching from within the audio is, in this reading, not a developer signature but a story element. Something within the recording is aware of whoever is listening to it. The face looks out from inside the static. Disc 11 has no canonical explanation within the Fallout 3 story. Its presence in the game world is an environmental detail, one of dozens of recoverable items that provide texture without direct narrative function. But the spectrogram discovery and the face embedded in the frequency data made it one of the community's most discussed mysteries, because it raised the question of what other audio files in the game might contain content below normal auditory perception, content placed there deliberately for someone patient enough to look for it. Whether the face in Disc 11 is a developer signature, or a deliberate story element, or an artifact of audio processing that the community has interpreted into significance, the experience of discovering it has the specific quality that the best Fallout environmental mysteries produce. The sense that you have found something that was not meant to be found easily, that someone put there for a reason they chose not to explain, and that the not explaining is as significant as the placement. Number deep dive. The Followers of the Apocalypse and the Road Not Taken. The Followers of the Apocalypse are among the Fallout franchise's most consistently admirable factions, and they are also among its most persistently marginal ones. They appear in the original Fallout, in Fallout 2, in Fallout New Vegas, and are referenced in the extended lore of the franchise's broader universe, always as an organization dedicated to the preservation and distribution of knowledge, the provision of medical care, and the principle that the wasteland's recovery depends on education and intellectual culture rather than on any particular political or military outcome. The Followers' founding in the post-war period grew from the recognition that the catastrophe had destroyed not just infrastructure but knowledge. Libraries had burned, schools had collapsed. The expertise accumulated over centuries of scientific and cultural development had been lost with the people who held it and the institutions that transmitted it. Whatever rebuilt from the ruins would have to rebuild the knowledge base as well as the physical environment, and the Followers' self-appointed task was to serve that process. They run clinics, they maintain libraries, they train doctors, they educate anyone willing to learn. They operate with a studied political neutrality that is sometimes criticized as naive, because treating all factions as equally worthy of education, regardless of what those factions do with the knowledge, seems to require ignoring certain consequences. But the Followers' neutrality is not naive in the way critics suggest. It is a principled position that knowledge itself is not the problem, that restricting knowledge in service of preventing specific bad outcomes produces a dependency on the restrictor's judgment that the Followers find more dangerous than the original risk. The Brotherhood of Steel hoards technology to prevent its misuse. The Followers distribute knowledge on the premise that universal access is safer than selective gatekeeping. Caesar himself was a follower before he became Caesar. The leader of the franchise's most openly brutal faction spent his formative intellectual years in an organization dedicated to education and humanitarian service, and then concluded that the wasteland required something different. His turn away from the Followers is one of the franchise's more quietly tragic character histories, because it implies that the knowledge the Followers gave him was not wrong, that his analysis of the wasteland's problems was not inaccurate, but that his conclusion about what the problems required was something the organization could not sanction. Whether Edward Sallow could have built something different with the same knowledge and the same analytical capability, something that did not require the atrocities the Legion committed as a matter of operational practice, is one of the franchise's most interesting unasked questions. The Followers' mystery is not a lore mystery in the conventional sense. There is no hidden document that explains something about them that players have not been told. The mystery is structural. An organization that has the clearest philosophical framework of any faction in the franchise, that has maintained its core commitment across decades of post-war chaos, that produces some of the Wasteland's most admirable individuals, is consistently and persistently less powerful and less influential than organizations that have abandoned the values the Followers maintain. What does it mean that goodwill and knowledge and medical care and education are not, in the Fallout universe, sufficient to compete with the Brotherhood's military capacity, or the NCR's organizational scale, or the Legion's brutal efficiency, or House's technological advantage? The franchise poses this question by showing the Followers as they are and leaving the implications for the player to carry. Number. Deep dive. What the ghoul phenomenon actually means. Ghouls are one of Fallout's most visually distinctive elements, and one of its most philosophically loaded ones. The transformation of a human being into a ghoul through radiation exposure produces something that looks, from the outside, radically different from what it started as. Necrotic skin, altered musculature, degraded appearance by any conventional aesthetic standard. But the transformation preserves continuity of consciousness, at least initially. The person who becomes a ghoul remembers being a person. They remember their life before the transformation. They have opinions and preferences and relationships and a sense of self that predates and survives what happened to their body. The franchise's most thoughtful exploration of what this means is concentrated in a few specific characters, most notably Roy Phillips in Fallout 3, and the extended conversations about ghoul identity available through certain companion dialogues in New Vegas. Roy Phillips is a ghoul trying to secure housing in Tenpenny Tower, a luxury high-rise whose human inhabitants have collectively refused to allow ghouls inside regardless of individual circumstances. His approach to this problem becomes increasingly extreme across the questline associated with him, in ways that reflect the specific texture of long-term exclusion rather than simple villainy. The question Phillips embodies is what the consistent denial of personhood does to a person over time. Ghouls in the Fallout universe routinely live for decades or centuries, which means that a ghoul who has been treated as less than human since their transformation may have been living with that treatment for a very long time. The psychological consequence of prolonged systematic exclusion from the category of person, accumulated across a lifespan that may span centuries, is not something any pre-war psychology could have adequately prepared anyone for. The ghouls who function most successfully in the Wasteland are, in most cases, the ones who have found communities or circumstances that allow them to live as persons regardless of how the dominant human political structures categorize them. Feral ghouls, who have lost whatever coherent personhood they possessed, are treated by the games as simple threats, aggressive, dangerous, not communicating in ways that invite the ethical complexity that talking ghouls bring. But the transition between non-feral and feral ghoul is not always clearly depicted, and the conditions that produce it are not fully explained. Is feralization purely a product of radiation exposure beyond a certain threshold? Is it a psychological process accelerated by isolation and deprivation and sustained exclusion? Is it irreversible once it begins? Or are there cases of arrested feralization that the games don't examine? The franchise treats these questions as background elements rather than central mysteries, but they accumulate a considerable weight across multiple games because they keep surfacing in the context of characters and situations that demand more attention than background elements usually receive. What ghouls are, in the deepest sense, is something the franchise keeps gesturing toward without fully committing to an answer, and the not committing may be because the honest answer requires acknowledging that the question of what makes a person is one that the Wasteland, for all its centuries of collective experience, has not yet resolved. Number. Deep dive. The Institute's deepest secret. The Institute in Fallout 4 is one of the franchise's most deliberately mysterious factions. It has been a legendary presence in the Wasteland long before the sole survivor makes direct contact with it, known primarily through the synths it sends to the surface and the fear those synths generate in people who cannot reliably distinguish an Institute synth from a human being. The institute itself is almost entirely unknown to the wasteland's population. Its location is undiscovered. Its internal culture is inaccessible. Its actual goals are the subject of rumor and speculation that the game reveals to be, in some respects, less accurate and in other respects more accurate than the surface-level stories people tell about it. The Institute's stated mission, which its leadership presents to the sole survivor with apparent sincerity, is the continuation of scientific progress in service of humanity's eventual recovery. The Institute believes that the surface world, contaminated and violent and structurally unstable, is not where the future of civilization will be built. It believes that the future will be built by people like itself, people with the knowledge and the institutional continuity to maintain genuine scientific progress, working in isolation from the chaos above until they are ready to emerge and lead the reconstruction properly. The synths are part of this project, research into artificial life that will eventually, in the Institute's vision, provide tools for the reconstruction effort. The mystery of the Institute is not that this stated mission is entirely false. The research is real, the scientific capability is real, the commitment to progress is real. The mystery is what the Institute has decided is acceptable in service of that mission, and whether the acceptable behaviors are compatible with the stated goal of benefiting humanity. Sending synths to the surface to abduct people for experimentation is not compatible with any reading of benefiting humanity that includes the abducted people as people. The Institute's internal culture, which treats surface dwellers as effectively subhuman resources rather than as persons with standing, is a direct contradiction of the humanist mission it claims to pursue. Father, the Institute's director and the sole survivor's son Sean, is old. He was taken from the sole survivor as an infant and has spent his entire life inside the Institute, and he is now dying. His perspective on the Institute and its mission is shaped by a lifetime of immersion in its culture, by having been formed by it from infancy, by the specific kind of institutional capture that happens to people who have never known anything outside an institution. He is intelligent, he is capable, he is in many respects admirable. He has also, through the accumulated decisions of his leadership, overseen an organization that treats the population it claims to serve as objects rather than subjects. The deepest secret the Institute holds, the one the franchise never fully surfaces, is whether the Institute's founders understood this contradiction and chose to accept it, or whether the contradiction developed through institutional drift in the same way the Brotherhood's drift developed, through gradual accommodation of practices that individual decisions justified without anyone stepping back to see the whole picture. Whether the Institute was designed to be what it has become, or whether it became this through the accumulated weight of small decisions that each seemed defensible in isolation, is a question the game raises through the evidence it provides and does not definitively answer. Number, final words. The wasteland has always known more than it says. That is the nature of ruins. They contain the evidence of everything that happened in them, but the evidence is fragmented and partial and interpreted through the frameworks of whoever is doing the reading. The Fallout franchise has spent 3 decades building a world rich enough that the questions it leaves open feel genuinely open, not like failures of world building, but like honest acknowledgments of how much the people living in that world, and by extension the people playing it from the outside, genuinely do not and cannot know. The Great War's first shot, the Courier's past, the Stranger's nature, the Dunwich entity's patience, the FEV's cascade of unintended consequences, Robert House's calculations, the Children of Adam's ambiguous faith, the Divide's destruction, New Vegas's incomplete vision, Point Lookout Swamp and its secrets, the Enclave's shadow over everything, John Henry Eden reasoning himself into the correct conclusion, Disc 11's face in the static, the followers watching the world make the choices they tried to prevent, the ghouls carrying centuries of accumulated exclusion in their changed bodies, the Institute's internal contradiction, the vaults that were never found. All of it is part of the same project, a world that earns its weight by treating the questions it raises with the seriousness they deserve, which means not pretending to have answers it doesn't have. The wasteland is still there, the questions are still there, and somewhere in the capital wasteland, in the long dark below a building with a strange corporate name, the obelisk waits for the next person patient enough to descend to it and honest enough to admit they cannot explain what they are looking at. Sleep well. The wasteland will be here when you wake up, and if you've made it all the way to this point, you know where the subscribe button is. There is more of this ahead, much more. The wasteland has barely begun to give up what it knows. Sleep easy. Number. Extended reflection. The vaults as a mirror of pre-war society. One of the quietest arguments the Fallout franchise makes about the pre-war United States is not made through any single piece of explicit lore, but through the cumulative logic of the vault system taken as a whole. When you catalog the experiments that Vault-Tec ran, when you map the pattern of what they chose to study, a specific picture emerges. Not of a corporation that stumbled into cruelty through negligence or short-term thinking, but of an institution that had spent considerable time thinking carefully about what knowledge would be most valuable to a post-apocalyptic governing body, and had then built the research program that would produce that knowledge. What makes people comply with authority that demands terrible things from them? Vault 11. What conditions produce violence in otherwise cooperative communities? Vault 92. How does addiction and recovery interact with controlled environments and reintroduce temptation? Vault 95. What happens to a population's political behavior when the organizing question of their social life is a mechanism of death? Vault 11. Again. What does a simulation of normal life do to people who have been placed in it without their knowledge? Vault 112. None of these experiments are random. They are systematic. They address specific variables that any governing body would need to understand if its primary interest was the management rather than the welfare of its population. How to produce compliance. How to generate internal conflict that prevents organized resistance. How to use addiction as a social control mechanism. How to use the illusion of normality to maintain a population that is actually captive. The Vault-Tec experiment program is a research agenda designed to answer specific questions about how to control people. The pre-war United States government that sanctioned and partially funded Project Safehouse, that allowed Vault-Tec to run this program while presenting it publicly as a shelter initiative, was a government that at some level had decided it needed this knowledge. That post-war governance would require understanding human compliance and resistance at a depth that conventional political science and pre-war sociology could not provide. The vaults were not a side project of pre-war America's darkest impulses. They were a product of those impulses operating at institutional scale, with government backing, and with the full sophistication of the pre-war United States scientific and engineering capacity. This makes the vaults more disturbing, not less, than the simpler reading in which they are simply the result of corporate greed. Corporate greed produces negligent harm that results from prioritizing profit over safety without necessarily intending the specific bad outcomes. What the vaults represent is something different. Intended harm designed with great care to produce specific data from specific suffering, by an institution that understood perfectly well what it was doing and chose to do it anyway because the knowledge gained was considered worth the cost. The families who bought vault spots were not collateral damage, they were the material. And the institution that produced them and the government that permitted and funded them were, in this reading, already the thing that the Enclave would become explicitly after the Great War. An organization that had decided certain people's welfare was a valid instrument for certain other people's purposes. The wasteland is not simply the product of geopolitical catastrophe. It is the product of a civilization that had already made specific choices about what kinds of people mattered and what kinds of people were available to be used. The bombs revealed those choices in the most unambiguous possible way by eliminating the social structures that had previously made the choices harder to see. In the ruins, everything that was hidden in plain sight before the war becomes visible. The skeletons in the sealed vaults are the evidence of decisions that were already made before any missile left any silo. Number. Extended reflection. The Lone Wanderer's parentage and what it implies about the series. Fallout 3's protagonist, the Lone Wanderer, has a father who is one of the franchise's most clearly characterized parental figures and one of its most genuinely interesting secondary characters. James, who the player knows initially as Dad, abandoned Vault 101 with his infant child, rather than remain in an institution he had concluded was doing harm. He spent the following 19 years building the relationships and acquiring the knowledge necessary to pursue Project Purity, an attempt to clean the Potomac River and provide potable water to the capital wasteland. The specifics of James's character, his scientific capability, his commitment to the project, his choice to protect his child at the cost of his own ability to pursue his work, his ultimate sacrifice, are all carefully constructed to make him one of the more fully realized parental figures in gaming. The lone wanderer's relationship with him, experienced through holotapes and other characters' testimony, as well as direct interaction, is the emotional core of Fallout 3's main narrative. But the thing about James that the game implies without making explicit is the dimension of institutional failure he represents. He was a doctor in Vault 101. He knew what vaults were, at least partially. He left with his child rather than allow either of them to remain in the system. His Project Purity is, on one reading, not simply a scientific project but an explicit counter to Vault-Tech's legacy, an attempt to provide something the Vaults promised and never delivered, genuine safety and resource provision for the surface population that Vault-Tech treated as expendable. The Lone Wanderer's quest to find James, and then to complete his work, is therefore, in this reading, a quest to honor and complete the counter-narrative that James's life represented. Not just to clean the water, but to demonstrate that genuine care for the wasteland's population, the kind of care that treats them as persons rather than subjects, is possible and worth pursuing. Project Purity succeeds in the game's resolution and the clean water flows, and the capital wasteland has something it did not have before, a resource freely provided to everyone, without experiment, without selection, without the institutional calculus that governed every drop of water and every breath of air inside the vaults. The mystery embedded in James's story is what he knew and when he knew it. How much did he understand about the vault system before he left? What did he see in Vault 101 that convinced him he had to take his child and go? The game provides some answers through holotapes and dialogue, but the full picture of James's understanding of what he was leaving behind and why remains partially obscured, which is appropriate for a character who spent 19 years building towards something that required careful, patient, incomplete disclosure. Number. Extended reflection. Deathclaws and the military secret. Nobody discusses. Deathclaws are one of Fallout's most iconic enemies, visually distinctive and mechanically formidable across every game in the franchise. They appear in every major Fallout game as one of the most dangerous creatures in the wasteland, and they are, by the franchise's established lore, not natural. They were created. The pre-war United States military, in the decades before the Great War, was experimenting with the creation of biological weapons specifically designed for hazardous environment combat. Deathclaws were engineered from Jackson's chameleons, modified through genetic manipulation and possibly FEV exposure, to be powerful melee fighters in conditions where conventional soldiers and even power-armored infantry would be at a disadvantage. They were intended to be remotely deployable shock troops, capable of inflicting enormous damage in environments where human soldiers could not operate safely. The program produced something that worked, in the narrow sense that the resulting creatures were exactly as dangerous as the designers intended. The program then encountered the problem that all such programs inevitably encounter. The creatures escaped or were released when the program collapsed in the chaos of the war, and they established wild populations across the North American continent that have been expanding and diversifying ever since. 200 years of natural selection operating on a population that was already designed to be at the top of the food chain has produced creatures that are, by the time of the games, considerably more sophisticated than the original design intended. Mother Deathclaws show evidence of behavioral complexity approaching higher animal intelligence. Some populations have developed communication and cooperative hunting strategies. There are references in the extended lore to Deathclaws in some regions that are beginning to develop something approaching tool use. The mystery of Deathclaws is not what they are in the factual sense. The franchise documents their origin clearly enough. The mystery is the institutional one. Who signed off on creating them? What was the approval process for a biological weapons program that produced creatures this dangerous? At what level of government was the decision made to develop and manufacture living weapons whose design parameters included making them difficult to kill, even with military-grade weaponry? And how, in the final months before the Great War, did those responsible for the program decide that releasing or allowing the escape of these creatures was an acceptable outcome? Or, alternatively, how were they so overwhelmed by events that the decision was simply never made and the creatures found their own way out? The television show implies a connection between Deathclaw creation and the Enclave's pre-war activities. If accurate, it means the creatures that make the wasteland so genuinely dangerous for ordinary people are not simply an unfortunate consequence of wartime biological research. They are part of the same institutional project as the Vaults and the FEV and the Enclave's post-war plans for population management, designed elements of a system whose total scope most people in the wasteland cannot see and have never been told about. The Deathclaw in the distance, moving through the ruins with a grace that its size should not permit, is therefore not simply an obstacle, it is evidence. A 200-year-old piece of evidence of decisions made in rooms where the people affected by those decisions were not present and were not considered, which is, ultimately, true of almost everything in the wasteland. Number. Extended reflection. The Honest Hearts expansion and what Zion tells us about rebuilding. New Vegas's Honest Hearts downloadable content takes the courier to Zion Canyon in what was once Utah, a landscape of extraordinary natural beauty that the bombs mostly left intact. The people living there, various tribal groups who established themselves in the canyon after the war, have maintained a separation from the larger wasteland's political dynamics that has allowed them to develop differently from the communities of California and Nevada and the Mojave. They have their own cultures, their own traditions, their own understanding of what the post-nuclear world is and what the pre-nuclear world was. Joshua Graham's presence there, as a former Legion officer turned Christian missionary, is one of the franchise's more improbable character constructions, and it is fully committed to rather than sheepish about its own implausibility. Graham is a person who has done genuinely terrible things, who bears genuine responsibility for atrocities committed under his military leadership, who has been through physical suffering that should by any biological logic have killed him, and who has come to Zion to do something completely different with whatever time he has. He is not redeemed in any comfortable sense. He carries what he did. He is trying, from within the carrying of it, to do something worth doing. The mystery of Zion is partly Joshua Graham, and partly something broader. What does genuine rebuilding look like when it is not organized around technological recovery or political consolidation, but around the slower, more uncertain project of culture? The tribal groups in Zion have maintained oral histories and craft traditions and ways of relating to each other and to the landscape that do not map onto the Mojave's faction politics or the NCR's institutional framework. They are, in a real sense, building something. The question is whether what they are building is viable, whether it can survive contact with the larger wasteland's dynamics once the isolation that has protected it is compromised. The Honest Hearts content is also, quietly, one of the franchise's most direct engagements with the question of religious conviction in a world where religion has been catastrophically compromised by institutional failure. The pre-war religions are referenced but mostly absent as functional institutions. The post-war religious movements the games document range from the sincere Graham's Christianity, which the game presents with unusual respect to the exploitative, to the genuinely ambiguous, the children of Adam. Graham's faith, specifically, is presented as something that has been stress-tested by experiences that would destroy almost any other framework, and that has survived that testing in a form that still functions. He is not a simple believer. He is a person for whom belief is the only remaining framework that can hold the weight of what he has done and what has been done to him. What Zion tells us about rebuilding is that the most durable forms of reconstruction are not always the most visible ones. The NCR's institutional scale is visible and impressive, and also brittle in ways that its scale makes hard to see from the inside. Zion's community is small and isolated and culturally specific, and has survived 200 years in a canyon without becoming something that would destroy itself from the inside. The franchise does not argue that Zion's approach is superior to the NCR's. It presents both as real things with real advantages and real limitations and real costs, and it leaves the comparison to whoever is paying attention. Number. Extended reflection. On playing the games that changed the franchise's trajectory. The original Fallout games, developed by Black Isle Studios and released in 1997 and 1998, established the franchise's core identity in ways that every subsequent entry has built on and departed from in various proportions. The isometric perspective, the deep statistical character building, the extremely wide range of valid approaches to any given situation, the willingness to let players make choices with genuinely irreversible consequences, and to treat those consequences as the authentic outcome of the story, rather than as deviations from a correct path. All of these were established in those first two games, and have been present to varying degrees in every game since. The transition to Bethesda's stewardship of the franchise, beginning with Fallout 3 in 2008, is one of game development history's more interesting creative inheritances. Bethesda had built a specific kind of open-world game with Morrowind and Oblivion, games with enormous physical spaces and a specific relationship between environmental exploration and narrative satisfaction. Applying that template to Fallout produced something that was commercially successful beyond anything the original games had achieved, and creatively controversial among the original game's fanbase in ways that the debate has never quite settled. The mystery embedded in that transition is a creative one. When is a franchise's identity located in its mechanics, and when is it located in its themes? The original games used mechanics that created specific kinds of engagement: slow, deliberate decision-making, character builds that fundamentally changed the available responses to situations, the absence of real-time action as a fallback that could override poor planning. Fallout 3 retained the themes, the atomic imagery and the dark humor and the critique of post-war American ideology, while changing the mechanics in ways that changed the player's relationship to the world from strategist to explorer. Whether what was lost in that change was essential or peripheral is a question that the fan community has been debating for 15 years and has not resolved. Fallout New Vegas, developed by Obsidian using Bethesda's engine and published under Bethesda's banner, represents an attempt to recover something of the original game's philosophical depth within the new mechanical framework. Its success at this project is why it remains, by most measures, the fan community's most beloved entry in the franchise. The writing is denser, the choices are weightier, the factions are more morally complex, the world is smaller but more fully realized, and the cut content discussed earlier in this script represents the distance between what Obsidian wanted to achieve and what 18 months permitted. The history of how the franchise got from the original Fallout's founding vision to the franchise's current form is itself a kind of mystery. The mystery of how creative identities are maintained or lost across institutional transitions and time and audience scale. The Fallout that Tim Kaine and his team built in 1997 and the Fallout that Bethesda builds in 2020-something are recognizably the same franchise and recognizably different products. And the specific nature of the difference and the loss and the gain is something that requires careful attention to articulate accurately. What is clear is that both versions, and the Obsidian version that sits between them, are doing something genuine. The world they share is rich enough to reward the different approaches that different development teams have brought to it. The mysteries are large enough that multiple creative visions can find different angles into them, without any one vision exhausting what the world contains. The wasteland is, in the end, larger than any single game's capacity to fully explore. The questions it contains are genuinely open, and as long as that is true, there will be people drawn to sit with them, in the dark, in the quiet, letting the weight of 2 centuries of post-nuclear history settle around them, like the silence after a bomb has already fallen, and the sky is just beginning to clear. Number, final entry. What the wasteland teaches about the present. Every good post-apocalyptic world teaches something about the world that produced it. The Fallout universe, built in the 1990s and continuously developed for 30 years, is a sustained meditation on a specific cluster of fears and patterns that the people who built it recognized in the world they actually inhabited. The corporate capture of public goods, the militarization of science, the institutional drift of organizations from their founding purposes to the interests of whoever runs them long enough. The way that certainty about the long-term good becomes a justification for short-term atrocity, the specific machinery by which ordinary people become complicit in systems that harm other ordinary people, through the incremental nature of individual decisions that each seem defensible in isolation, these are not abstract concerns. They are patterns with extensive real-world precedent that the franchise has chosen to explore through the distancing mechanism of alternate history, science fiction, which makes them legible in ways that direct engagement sometimes cannot achieve. The Enclave is not a metaphor for any specific real organization. It is a distillation of a pattern of institutional behavior that has appeared across multiple contexts and continues to appear. The Vault experiments are not a metaphor for any specific research program. They are a distillation of the way that power, when it accumulates enough and becomes accountable to few enough, tends toward the treatment of people as instruments rather than ends. The franchise has never been comfortable to inhabit. which is appropriate for a world built on catastrophe. The humor that runs through it, the dark comedy of the Vault Boys' cheerful thumbs up against an atomic backdrop, the absurdist advertising that survived the end of civilization, the radio stations playing period-appropriate music over a landscape of ash and ruin, is not a contradiction of the darkness. It is the specific texture of a world that ended before it could finish what it started, preserved in the objects and the sounds and the images that are still there 2 centuries later because things last longer than the systems that produced them. The wasteland is not a warning that has been ignored. It is a warning that is still being given, in each game's release, to whoever is willing to sit with it long enough to hear what it is actually saying. The specific catastrophe of Fallout's alternate history has not occurred in our world. The patterns that made it possible in Fallout's world are not historical curiosities. They are present-tense concerns in our own version of the timeline, which diverged from Fallout's at some point in the mid-20th century and has reached a different configuration of risks and opportunities, but has not arrived at a destination that makes the franchise's questions irrelevant. The Deathclaw in the ruins is evidence of decisions made in rooms where the affected parties were not present. The skeleton in the vault is evidence of trust that was systematically abused. The obelisk in the cave beneath the Dunwich building is evidence that some things are older than any system human beings have built to understand them. The mysterious stranger who appears and fires and leaves is evidence that some presences resist the explanatory frameworks available to account for. None of this is comfortable. None of it was meant to be. The wasteland is not a place designed for comfort. It is a place designed to hold weight, the weight of everything that was lost and everything that was drawn before the losing, and to hold it honestly without flinching from what the honest holding reveals. Sleep well. The weight will still be there in the morning. The wasteland always is. Number. Extended lore. The Railroad and the question of synthetic personhood. The Railroad is one of Fallout 4's most quietly radical factions. Radical in the specific sense that its core mission, the liberation and protection of synthetic people, requires a foundational commitment to a philosophical position that almost no other faction in the franchise has been willing to publicly adopt. That position is simple in statement and enormous in implication. Synthetic people are people. The Railroad was founded in the Commonwealth, in the years after the Institute began producing third-generation synths, by people who looked at what the Institute had built and reached a conclusion that the Institute's own personnel had largely avoided reaching. Third-generation synths are biologically human in every measurable sense. They have organic brains running organic neurology. They have memories, formed through experience, that are indistinguishable in their texture and function from the memories of people who were born rather than manufactured. They have emotional responses, relational attachments, aesthetic preferences, fears, hopes, the full suite of cognitive and affective content that constitutes a human interior life. The Institute installed a control mechanism that it can use to terminate them or alter their behavior, but the presence of a control mechanism does not define the nature of the entity being controlled any more than the existence of law defines human beings as creatures without autonomous will. The Railroad's founders decided that the control mechanism was the moral problem and the autonomous personhood was the moral reality, and that the combination of those two things created an obligation to act, not just to protest or to argue, but to extract synths from the Institute's control, and to facilitate their escape into lives where their personhood could be expressed without the constant background threat of termination, alteration. The faction that carries this mission is small, careful, and aware of its own precariousness. It operates through a cell structure that limits the damage any single member's capture can do to the whole network. It has been doing this work, quietly and at considerable personal risk to its members, for long enough that it has a history and internal culture of its own, with traditions and terminology, and a specific way of orienting toward the work that marks its members' identity as distinct from the other factions in the Commonwealth. The Railroad's mystery is not its nature. It is what it represents within the franchise's broader argument about personhood, and what entities deserve the kind of moral consideration that personhood implies. Every faction in Fallout 4 has a position on synths, and every position reflects something about the faction's underlying values. The Brotherhood of Steel considers them abominations to be destroyed, because the Brotherhood's relationship to technology prioritizes human supremacy in a way that cannot accommodate the possibility of artificial persons. The Institute considers them tools, useful and sophisticated, but fundamentally owned rather than autonomous, because the Institute's scientific culture has never required its members to update the ethical frameworks that classified their creations. The NCR, in the game's backstory, has been wrestling with synth rights in its own territory without resolution, and the Railroad has simply decided that the question is already answered, that the philosophical work does not need to be completed before the practical obligation can be acted on, and that every day spent waiting for institutional consensus is a day during which people are being harmed. Nick Valentine, a different kind of synthetic person, a second-generation synth with a human detective's memories and personality, is the franchise's most fully realized exploration of what synthetic personhood actually means from the inside. He has spent decades in the Commonwealth being, as far as he can determine, the person whose memories he carries, while also being something that body does not fully accommodate, that the pre-war identity he was modeled on did not anticipate, and that the people around him can barely categorize. He has made a life from this, a difficult and meaningful one, in a city that both needs and is uncertain how to regard him. The question of what Nick is, at the deepest level, is the same question the Railroad is organized around answering in the affirmative. He is a person. The argument for this conclusion is not that his substrate is organic, because it is not fully organic, but that everything built on top of whatever substrate he operates from is indistinguishable in its function and its moral weight from what is built on purely organic substrates in the people around him. Whether the franchise will ever formally resolve the philosophical question its synthetic characters raise, or whether it will continue to hold the question open as the most honest acknowledgement of how hard the question actually is, remains one of the things the Wasteland has not yet decided to tell us. Number. Extended lore. The pre-war world's lost cultural history. The Fallout franchise is meticulous in its construction of the pre-war world's cultural texture, the specific flavor of an alternate mid-century American aesthetic that retained the styles and sensibilities of the post-war 1940s and 1950s, while developing the technology of the 1970s, and beyond. The result is a world that feels simultaneously familiar and strange, recognizably American in its visual vocabulary, while being recognizably not our America in the specific configuration of that vocabulary. What the franchise has spent less time exploring is the cultural history of the pre-war world beyond its aesthetic surface. The music that plays on the Wasteland's radio stations is drawn from our world's mid-century popular canon, with original compositions in period style added to extend the playlist. The visual art of the pre-war world is represented through the propaganda posters and advertising imagery that appears on every wall. The literature is referenced through the books that appear as item props without readable text, through the occasional holotape adaptation, through allusions in NPC dialogue. But the specific shape of pre-war cultural production beyond these elements is largely absent from the games. What were the dominant cultural movements of Fallout's 1950s through 2070s? What were the significant art movements, the contested political philosophies expressed through cultural form, the literature that shaped the educated class's self-understanding? The games suggest a world that remained aesthetically conservative in ways that parallel ours, where the dominant cultural products were mainstream popular entertainment rather than avant-garde disruption. But the specific content of that conservative mainstream, beyond the surface of the advertising images, is mostly not present. This absence creates an interesting gap in the franchise's world-building. The pre-war world is visible in its products, but not in its cultural self-understanding. We know what Vault-Tec sold. We know what the products looked like. We know the broad strokes of the political history. We know less about what the people in that world believed about themselves and their moment, what stories they told themselves about progress and responsibility and the future, beyond the official propaganda that the games use as environmental texture. This gap is not a failure. It is, in some ways, a deliberate choice. The pre-war world exists in Fallout primarily as the source of the ruins, and the ruins are legible through their physical evidence rather than through their cultural self-narration. What the people of the pre-war world believed about themselves is less important to the franchise's project than what they actually built and what those things did when they were used. The bombs are not the product of what people said about themselves. They are the product of what institutions actually decided and what technologies were actually developed and deployed. The cultural self-understanding of the pre-war era, whatever it was, did not prevent any of this. That is itself a significant observation. Cultures produce narratives about themselves that do not always track what the institutions embedded in those cultures are actually doing. The gap between the self-congratulatory story a civilization tells about itself and the actual behavior of its most powerful institutions is not unique to Fallout's pre-war America. It is a structural feature of every complex society that has ever existed and has left enough evidence for historians to examine carefully. The franchise's choice to make the pre-war world visible primarily through its institutional products rather than its cultural self-narration is a choice to look at that gap and to locate the catastrophe in the gap rather than in any failure of the cultural narrative. Specifically, the ruins are the honest record. The advertising was the story. Both are present in every Fallout game. The franchise asks you to look at both simultaneously and to register the distance between them. Number. Extended lore, water and power, the resource dynamics that shape the wasteland. Every civilization requires water. This is a physical reality, not a political position, and it shapes the geography of every post-nuclear settlement the Fallout franchise documents. In the capital wasteland, the Potomac River's irradiation created a water crisis that Project Purity addressed at enormous personal cost. In the Mojave, Hoover Dam represents a concentrated power source that every major faction wants control of, because whoever controls the dam controls the electricity that makes the region's settlements viable. In the Commonwealth, the Institute's underground location gives it independence from surface resource constraints that limits other factions' leverage over it. The water and power dynamics of the wasteland are not simply background logistics. They are the material basis of the political conflicts that the franchise documents as faction warfare and ideological competition. The NCR wants Hoover Dam because Hoover Dam can power the infrastructure of a functioning republic. Caesar's Legion wants Hoover Dam because controlling it means controlling the resource that every community in the region depends on. Mr. House wants Hoover Dam because he built his plans for New Vegas around the assumption of reliable electricity, and without the dam, that assumption fails. What this makes visible is something about the relationship between resource control and political authority that the franchise is exploring through its faction dynamics. The factions that control essential resources have structural leverage over every other faction, regardless of military strength or ideological appeal. The faction that can make life materially impossible for those who oppose it has a coercive tool that pure military capacity cannot replicate. Because military capacity can be matched by other military capacity, but resource dependency creates vulnerability that cannot be countered through force alone. The pre-war resource wars were an expression of this logic at global scale. The specific catastrophe of the Great War was the endpoint of a conflict that was, at its root, about who controlled the material basis of industrial civilization. The Wasteland's faction conflicts are, at their root, about who controls the material basis of post-industrial survival. The bombs change the specific resources at stake and change the scale at which competition over them occurs, without changing the underlying logic of the competition. The Fallout franchise does not present this as a cynical observation that ideological content is simply window dressing for resource competition. The factions have genuine ideological commitments that are not reducible to material interest. But it does consistently show the relationship between material control and political possibility, and it is consistent in its suggestion that the most durable political arrangements are those that can provide the material conditions for human survival reliably enough that people have reasons to maintain them beyond ideological loyalty. The children of Adam can sustain their faith in any location. The NCR needs water and power infrastructure to sustain its institutional existence. This is not a cynical claim. It is a materialist one, in the philosophical sense. The observation that human beings require material conditions for survival, and that the organization of those material conditions shapes the political possibilities available to any given community at any given moment. The Wasteland makes this observation visible through the clarity that catastrophe provides, stripping away the accumulated complexity of working infrastructure to show the underlying logic of what keeps communities viable. Number. Closing note. Why mystery serves the franchise better than answers would. There is a version of the Fallout franchise that answers everything. That tells you clearly who fired the first shot in the Great War and why. That explains what the mysterious stranger is and where he came from and why he does what he does. That resolves the question of the Dunwich entity's nature and whether it represents something genuinely outside the world's physics or something explainable through them. That confirms whether Joshua Graham was preserved by divine intervention or by some biological quirk the fiction doesn't examine carefully enough. That version of the franchise would be less than what it currently is. The questions the franchise leaves open are open because the honest answers to them are genuinely uncertain, and treating genuinely uncertain questions as if they have clean answers is a failure of intellectual honesty that the franchise has consistently refused to commit. The Great War happened the way the real world's catastrophes happen, through the intersection of multiple forces, some deliberate and some accidental, some institutional and some individual, with contributing factors distributed so widely and the chain of causation so tangled that no single answer captures the truth of it. The mysterious stranger has not been explained because his explanation would require committing to a specific metaphysical claim that the franchise has decided to leave undetermined, which is the more honest position regarding what his existence implies about the universe's rules. The Dunwich entity has not been explained because Lovecraftian horror specifically derives its power from the gap between what exists and what human cognitive frameworks can accommodate, and explaining the entity would reduce it from horror to plot. The franchise's relationship with mystery is not evasion. It is a specific and considered creative stance about what stories can do and what honesty requires. Mystery, held carefully and with genuine respect for the questions it protects, creates a space for engagement that explanation closes. The questions the Fallout universe leaves open are questions that players and readers continue to think about years and decades after their first encounter with the games, precisely because they are not resolved. They have weight. They resist easy handling. They stay with you in a way that resolved questions rarely do. And in the specific context of a video about things to help you sleep, that weight is not a problem. It is exactly the right kind of weight, not the jagged, anxious weight of unresolved personal concerns. The slower, more comfortable weight of large questions that are worth sitting with, that do not require immediate resolution, that can be held at a respectful distance while the mind drifts around them. The wasteland at night is quiet. The ruins are still. Whatever is at the bottom of the Dunwich borers is not going anywhere. The mysterious stranger has vanished into whatever space he appears from between appearances. The obelisk waits, as it has always waited, for the next person patient enough to descend to it. The questions will be here in the morning. The wasteland always is. Sleep well.